How's everybody doing? Can you hear me? There you are. Okay, good. All right. Let's take a look at what we have left. We are finishing out closing the transaction. I'm going to get into real property valuation. I'm going to do the math tutorial session this Saturday. I need to make that 11 to whatever, 11 to 12, and we can bump over toward 1 if we need to. But we'll start that at 11, this same login, same Zoom login. I'll see you here. I will record it for those of you who can't make it. And if you do have questions between now and then that you want us to cover, just shoot them to me and we'll make sure to include them. If you can't make it, or if you can, just bring those questions with you. And we'll work on all things math and anything else that we have time for. Okay. So here we go. Real property valuation is a 6-hour session. Oops, there we go. And then, so that means tomorrow we'll get into property insurance most likely as well. Then next week, landlord tenant property management, then a whole bunch of them knocked out in a night or so. And we'll pretty much have license law and commission rules covered, but let's start with that because we haven't visited that in a while. Take a look at license law and rules. Hopefully you've read through the entire thing by now. And hopefully working on your second or maybe even third time through. The first time is always just kind of getting a feel for the material. And this, either that or the second time, you're going to want to be highlighting the key points. How do you know what to highlight when you're reading down through this PDF? What is your guideline for knowing what to highlight? You can tell me in the chat. You can speak up either way. It's this thing. Sir? Well, that's a good one. Yeah, that's probably pretty safe. But always lead with this, right? In fact, I would just go down through this first, the section in the syllabus, that pertains to that, and that should be the way you handle every chapter. So if we're focusing on the comments, license law, commission rules, all that's good stuff. Here we go. We're going to go down through here and say, oh, where's the basic license? What is the basic licensing requirement? Let's go find it, right? And get these nice and close. There it is. It's the very first part of the comment section. You could also cross-check it and see that it's in 93A-1, which is referenced right here as well. So you can find it that way too. You could, if you have this Adobe or some form of PDF reader, maybe look in the upper corner and find the Find button. Then you can use certain keywords like requirement. And then it'll just show you what all of those are. And that might help you get to the bottom of where certain words that show in the syllabus are here in this comment section. So what? Any person or entity who engages in the real estate. We'll get to what that means in a second. For compensation. So doing real estate for compensation for someone else requires a license. And a real estate licensee may only engage in brokerage as an agent for a party to the transaction. So a license is commonly and appropriately referred to as a licensee, is referred to as an agent. Although we know when we studied the agency chapter that the word agent in that sense is referring to the firm. But it's sort of like firm and the broker within that firm are one and the same almost, because we are co-brokers, we are sub-agents to the agent, and the agent is the firm. So now at this point in your studies, you've got to put these pieces together, sort of almost a level 3 understanding of a lot of this stuff. They make a mention here that just because you have a license doesn't mean you are a realtor. What is it that makes you a realtor? Is it the real estate license? What is it? There it is. Joe says a member of a realtors association. Yeah. It's a trade organization. It's a trade association. So it's just paying money. But it's not just that you guys can join that yet. You're going to have to pass this test, pass the PSI. Then you'll be able to join the Realtor Association. So membership to an agency, membership to an association is a better word for that. And then paying dues every year. So every licensee is not necessarily a realtor. How many licensees are we pretty sure are not realtors? Or maybe ask it this way. Which licensees are we pretty confident are not realtors? Which ones? What kind of licensee was probably not a realtor right now? If we were to look in the bulletin provided by the Real Estate Commission every month, where it breaks down how many licensees are active and inactive, we would see that there's probably about 17,000. I think it's about 15 or 17,000 inactive brokers. And if you're not active, you're not going to be paying for realtor membership, right? So definitely those. And then a handful of the ones that are active, because maybe even though they're active, they're not paying. That's something we ran into in 2008. Agents got out of the business, but they kept their license. They just unaffiliated with the firm. If they were a full broker, a non-provisional broker, then they could unaffiliate and just be a sole proprietor at home, and just really they weren't doing real estate, but they were keeping the license. They excused themselves from the MLS, so they didn't have to pay that anymore. They couldn't really do anything, right? And what we learned before too is if you are a sole proprietor, that means you're not an entity. You've not set up an LLC or a subchapter C, or subchapter S, or a C corporation or an LLP. So if you're a sole proprietor, you could get away with not having a broker in charge. It's just that there's not much you could do if you don't have a broker in charge. In order to do some things, you have to have a broker in charge. What could you do without one? There were 3 things that you can do without a broker in charge when you're a sole proprietor. One of those things that you sole proprietor without a BIC. Can't have a trust account unless you have a BIC. Can't have associated brokers under you, or affiliated brokers. And there's the big one. What's the big one that you can't do without a BIC as a sole proprietor? What's the thing that's going to keep you from making very much money? There's only a couple of ways you could possibly make money if you're a sole proprietor but have no broker in charge. If you're a sole proprietor without a BIC, you cannot promote or advertise. So that means what? You can't actively solicit, right? If someone were to say, hey, I heard you have a license, can you help me buy something? Yes, you could help them, but because you didn't go after them. Or if they said, hey, I want to buy in Arizona, can you refer a good agent to me over there? You could refer them an agent and make money at that because you didn't go after it. But if you said, well, I'm just going to sit here on the couch watching Price is Right, and I'm going to tell everybody that if they need a referral broker, they can come to me. Well, you just advertised. If you made a website, if you made a business card, if you made a Facebook page or group, then you promoted. And then all of this it's not going to work. You're a sole proprietor without a BIC. You're not allowed to promote or advertise. So don't forget about that little nuance. This might be something, a sole proprietor with no broker in charge, that's good for someone that's mostly retired or has a full-time job somewhere else, what I call a real job, because they have a 9-to-5 W-2 kind of thing. They're making a salary, and they're doing that, really. That's how they pay their bills, but the real estate license is on the side. And if enough people know that they have a license, maybe some people will come to them without them asking, without them having to promote. So, what are some categories of licensee? Categories of licensee. These are easy points that you could easily see on the test. They would structure it as a multiple choice. The following are categories of licensee. A, provisional broker. B, non-provisional broker. C, broker in charge. Or D, trying to think of a good one. Transactional broker. Which of the following is not? It would be D, is not. We don't do that. We don't do transactional, but we have provisional brokers. We have non-provisional brokers in charge, BIC eligible brokers that are also full brokers because you have to be one of those to become BIC eligible. But all of those are various categories. There is no requirement, or there is no type of real estate license called a commercial broker's license. There's no type of a license that's called a property manager's license. What you're about to get is what you need for any of that. You'll be equipped. It's just that you now have to learn the business and surround yourself with people that can teach you that business. All the real estate commission says about that is, don't be a commercial broker if you have no commercial broker guidance. They really would not want you to be under a broker in charge with no commercial experience, if that's what you're trying to do. Brokers in charge should have the experience needed to be in charge of the brokers under them. And I have a feeling that there's some problems with that out there in all of this, in the 17,000 firms that are across the state. What is it about your provisional broker category? Tell me some stuff about being a provisional broker. What is it? What's required of a provisional broker? Yes, close supervision by their BIC. Got to make sure there's a BIC that is teaching them, training them, because that BIC is on the hook for them. There it is. Kirsty says post-licensing courses, it's a temporary category. You don't get to be provisional forever. You are going to go inactive if you are active provisional, and within 18 months, you don't get those 3 post-licensing courses done, your license will go to inactive. And by the way, I don't think they'll test you in this course on this, but if you take a post-licensing course and go for more than 2 years before you finish, that one you took more than 2 years ago is wasted. You're going to have to take it again. So obviously you would not have been active during that time by that time because you would have gone longer than the 18 months required. But there are a lot of brokers out there that are still inactive and they're just slowly gathering up and taking their 3 post-licensing courses. But if they take too long, they might have to redo the one they did more than 2 years. They would have to redo the one that they did more than 2 years ago. That's bad news to give people. Broker in charge. What's required to become one? What sorts of things are required to become a broker in charge? That's a good one. Full broker, for sure. Got to have the experience as well. Oh, there it is. Take that broker in charge course. It's a 12-hour course online. I think it's like $110. Available online. 12-hour course. Experience, 2 years full-time, 4 years part-time, either or. And then after that, you're done spending extra money to become one or to stay one. There is no extra money required once you get it. What's required? What's the only thing ongoing required to remain and stay and keep your broker in charge eligibility? Some kind of class. A different kind of class than the one you took to get it. What could it be? There it is. Your general update now has to be a broker in charge update. Go from Gen Up to Bic Up. Now you're taking the Bic Up in place of the Gen Up. So no extra stuff, just a swap out. And in fact, the class itself isn't all that different from the update. It's all the same material pushed down to allow for about 20 to 30 minutes within the same 4 hours to deal with broker BIC related stuff. So not much difference once you get it. Here's another kind that we talked about. Tell me about a limited non-resident commercial broker. Who is that for? Must be out of state. If you have an address in North Carolina, this will not apply. You cannot get this thing. Right now is about 280 of them in the whole state. So must be out of state, must be coming in here to do what kind of real estate? Commercial only. There's no limited non-resident residential broker license, only for commercial. And there you go. Victor says you got to work with a North Carolina broker so that you can make sure that that out-of-state person who has no North Carolina license knows what the North Carolina rules and laws are. Someone who's on the hook to make sure they're following the right rules and laws. And what person is that? You say it has to work with a North Carolina broker. Does that mean broker in charge, or does that mean just full broker of some sort? Yeah, not necessarily broker in charge. Any full broker, ideally a commercial broker, right? Because they need to guide them in the ways of commercial. To become a firm, to get a firm license, who or what gets a firm license? What's a firm license for, or who? What has to be in place first before you can get that firm license? Firm license, is that for a human or no? Yeah, some kind of an entity. Could be an LLC, an LLP, a C corporation, a subchapter S. It's an entity. It's a business entity attached to a human, but it's an entity that needs that firm license. Why? If you're wanting to do real estate in the name of that LLC or other kind of entity, then it is the thing doing real estate for another for compensation, and therefore it needs a license because that's when a license is required. So there is something called a qualifying broker that sets up that entity and gets the firm license for that entity. And that qualifying broker, also called QB, designates the broker in charge of that entity. Because now that you have a firm license, you must have a BIC. Firm licenses require BICs almost all the time. There's one little caveat where you could set up an entity for yourself and get a firm license for it and not have to designate a broker in charge. What's the purpose of that firm/entity when you don't need a broker in charge? You're not a sole proprietor. You're an entity because you want your broker in charge to pay you, not in your human name, but in your LLC name. And in order for them to be able to do that, the reason you want them to do that is to have some liability protection, also have some tax benefits. But you're not interested in hanging a shingle, right? Starting your own firm out there on the streets and be competition to your current firm. You're happy with ABC Realty and the BIC of it. You're happy with ABC Realty's broker in charge. You're just going to say, hey, broker in charge of ABC, I want you to pay me through my entity from now on. And then my entity will pay me however we so choose. That's a little nuance, a little caveat that's possible when that's all you're trying to accomplish. Just getting the tax benefits and liability protection. And in that one very exclusive case, the commission allows you to not designate a BIC because you already have a BIC. You're staying there at your firm. ABC Realty's BIC is your BIC. So your little firm doesn't need one because it only exists for compensation purposes. So that might be a word you see in the answer choices. What type of firm doesn't need a BIC? One that's only for compensation purposes and you're staying in your same bigger firm. They're just paying you through the name of that entity. You set up the entity to get paid through, and so therefore it needs a firm license, but the commission realizes what your reason is for having that thing set up that way. And they say, well, then don't worry about designating a BIC. You don't need one for that little entity because you have one over your big firm under whom you work. What sorts of things constitute doing real estate? Brokerage activities, what are they? What are some brokerage activities? Property management, yeah, for sure. I think a couple of you are pretty interested in that. What other kinds of activities, brokerage activities are there? The most common one that we talk about the most probably. Yeah, just straight up selling. Selling, helping somebody sell their property, helping somebody buy properties for sale, managing properties. What else? A couple other ones. Yeah. Property management / leasing. Yeah. Helping somebody rent. Could be a tenant representative. But then there's a couple more. What's another method? Yeah, there you go. Referrals, pretty underappreciated, underwhelming. Little benefit of having your license. And then one more is basically a method of selling. What's a method of selling that you also need a real estate license for? Yeah. If you wanted to use auctioning to sell property, Got to have a real estate license, and what else? Auctioneer's license. You got it. There's a lot of tasks in this business. A lot of things that need to get done that don't actually require a license. So one of the first steps to expansion when you are in this business will be hiring an assistant. But the good news is you don't have to pay the extra money that it might cost to hire a licensed assistant. They might charge more. You might have to pay more to such a person. You could maybe get away with an unlicensed assistant for a while. So whether it's that scenario or any scenario where it's a person without a license, they can do some stuff around and sort of related to the real estate business. What sorts of things can an unlicensed person who earns a salary, not a commission-based income, what can someone without a license do? If you don't have a license, what can you do related to real estate? You are allowed to show one certain type of property, but you can't show a different kind of property. There we go. Deborah says you can show rentals, but what can you not show? Can't show houses for sale, properties for sale. Not allowed for unlicensed folks. Also, related to that, not allowed to do an open house all by yourself if you're unlicensed. You better believe a lot of agents would love it if they could send their unlicensed person out to sit in that open house and just gather up the contact info of those visitors, because it's probably not going to result in selling that house, and they have a million other things they'd rather be doing. The only reason they're sitting in that open house is A, to satisfy the seller, because the seller thinks that matters in getting their house sold because they don't know any better, and B, to maybe get a piece of business, a buyer, or maybe a neighbor who also might want to sell, a nosy neighbor who's coming to see that open house. So as far as getting that house sold on that day to a buyer that stumbles in there, highly unlikely. It's like single digit odds, like a 2 or 3% chance of that happening. 2 or 3% of the time that actually happens. But they can't. They can't send their unlicensed person in there to sit in that open house. They could have another licensee sit in the open house and maybe say, well, if you sit in my open house, you can have whatever leads come of it. That might be a thing that they go along with. And you do see that. Quite a lot of new agents ask agents with listings, may I hold your listing open if there's enough time? You better do it the first weekend. It's going to be sold pretty soon. What else can an unlicensed person do? Fill in contracts. You'll see on the answer choices on a multiple choice test for the broker, boss, right? For the licensee. Fill in contracts for the licensee. They can't fill in contracts for the client and explain it to the client unless it's a rental, unless it's a lease. But for a sale, they just have to do it for their boss. They can be a courier. Yeah, they can put on and remove lock boxes. That's good. They can handle the trust account, the earnest money, and all things related to the trust account. But who's ultimately responsible for what goes on with that trust account? Ultimately, the highest responsibility for the trust account of a firm, yeah, there we go, the broker in charge. The BIC is in charge of that. They could delegate it to an unlicensed person, usually an office manager, but they better keep an eye on it. There have been cases of embezzlement. There have been cases of just mistakes, and they're going to be facing disciplinary action too, because they need to check in. I'd say if I were going to have one, which I hope to never have one, but if I did, I could designate it or delegate it to an unlicensed office manager, but I'd probably look at it once a month when it needs to be reconciled, just to make sure everything went in and when it came out properly and all the paperwork was done right. They can order and supervise routine and minor repairs, but not major ones. Notice here, they say specifically minor in the latest CE course that you don't know about because you haven't had to take it. It specifically said, but not major ones. They can't oversee major repairs, but they can check in, let like repair companies in and supervise small repairs like that. They can actually provide factual info, meaning if somebody calls into the office and says, tell me about your listing at 123 ABC Street, they can answer some questions about it. But it can only be questions basically they're answering from reading the data sheet. And they have to be real careful not to overstep into negotiation territory. If the person said, oh, how much is it? $315. Well, would they take $305? Well, for one thing, not even you, the licensed broker, would answer that question, but an unlicensed person certainly can't. They're not allowed to. At least you could say something about it. They would just have to defer to you. Oh, I can't answer that question. Let me let you speak to my broker boss. They can coordinate and confirm appointments, although in our market, and I think probably in most MLSs, we have a built-in extra service with a local showing company that handles all the typical appointments, and we pretty much direct people to them. But sometimes you'll run into a listing that requires appointments be made by contacting the listing firm, and in that case, that unlicensed assistant could do that. Showing rentals, type offers, contracts, and leases from drafts of pre-printed forms completed by a licensee. Assist a licensee in assembling documents for closing. Basically, you could have your unlicensed assistant be a transaction coordinator. That's the official title of such a thing, such a person doing that type of job description. And when you get to have more and more consistent monthly closings, you don't need to be spending your time on a lot of that stuff. What is it? It's sending documents. It's to the closing attorney. It's rounding things up and passing them back and forth between the parties. When the inspections get done, and then you get the repairs negotiated, it's getting those pieces of paperwork changed or added or amended. The amendments are filled out. Oh, instead of fixing things, let's go ahead and drop the price, $4,000. Well, the person who fills out the amendment to drop the price for the $4,000 and then gets all the signatures does not have to be you. It can be your unlicensed assistant. You're assembling documents for closing. And then computing commission checks for licensees affiliated with the firm, acting as a bookkeeper. Notice some of these would specifically be for an office manager kind of position. Like this one, like the maintenance of the trust account. A lot of these are handled by that office manager in the firm. And that person's frequently unlicensed. And then there's a handful of exemptions, people who don't need a license but can still do real estate as well. And those include who? Who can do real estate without a license? Pretty much exactly as much real estate as we can do for someone else, but not having a license to do so. There it is. The big one is attorneys. Attorneys can do it, but only if it's in connection with legal business. They can't just hang up a sign and add to their law sign, so-and-so attorney and real estate agent services. But if that attorney work, legal work, requires handling a sale, that's allowable. That's an attorney at law, but also someone who is an attorney in fact. An attorney in fact means anybody that has been given a power of attorney. Somebody said, I don't want to do it myself. I want to give you permission to do it for me. And the you is their friend, their cousin, their brother, their kid, their parent. I can't, or the spouse. The spouse could be given a power of attorney. They would be, therefore, the attorney in fact for their other spouse. If you are handling property owned in the name of an entity, and you're the managing partner or the officer, general partner, an officer if it's a corporation, then you can do real estate without a license because you're doing the real estate owned by that entity, which happens to be an entity that you own or co-own or manage, right? There you go. Bankruptcy trustee, working for property managers. That's quite a common one. Being a guardian, an executor, an administrator, a court-ordered person responsible for another person. And that property manager one would be a W-2 salaried employee, which is what we kind of were talking about a minute ago. And then finally, selling your own stuff. Doesn't require a license. For sale by owner, for lease by owner, as well as housing authority, handling real estate. If you work for them, you can do the real estate that housing authority needs you to handle. Who are these creatures called the Real Estate Commission? Who's on the board? How many people are on that Real Estate Commission? 9 of them. Where did they come from? Who put them in place? A couple of different people, one of whom puts the most of them in place is the current governor. Puts 7 of them in place. Then one of them appointed by the House of North Carolina, one of them appointed by the Senate. How many have to have a real estate license? Have to be in the business? Minimum to be in the business, good job, 3 minimum on the 9. And then how many are not allowed to be involved in real estate at all? There you go, 2, at least 2. And right now, as we saw, I think once upon a time, out of the 9, it's pretty close. It's 5-4, licensed to unlicensed. It just so happens to be, tends to be, I've noticed that the unlicensed people are attorneys, but that doesn't have to be a thing. What sorts of things does the Real Estate Commission oversee? You know, they have a body of 60 employees that carry out their wishes. 60 employees carry out the wishes of the 9. The 9 are not paid. They're reimbursed for their travel and their time spent being commissioners, but it's not a paid position. It's not an elected position either. It's an appointed position, 2 days a month. And they, along with those 60 employees, are doing what sorts of things? What's the commission handling? The reason for the Real Estate Commission, that's good, is to protect the consumers. Yep. Handling complaints, that's part of protecting the consumers. Yeah. So they're in charge of the disciplinary action of us when the complaints are made. Also, there we go, they oversee the education requirements. Me sitting here talking to you, teaching this stuff, I can't just say, hey, I want to start doing that. I've got to be approved. I have to be in front of them, the education department of the Real Estate Commission, and pass some tests and basically audition, so to speak. I had to do a 1-hour recording. This is no longer the requirement. Now they changed it up. It's 15 minutes in person, but it used to be 1 hour or maybe 50 minutes on video teaching a thing. And they would either like it or not. They liked my first one, thank goodness, but I know somebody who tried 3 or 4 or 5 times before the commission said, no, you're not ready. Okay, now you are. Okay, good. So they make sure people are qualified to educate. They regulate activities. They can change rules, but it's not a quick and easy process because that often requires cooperation with the General Assembly of North Carolina. To change law, real estate law, is not just a real estate commission thing. It's not just up to the real estate commissioners to change the real estate law. They would have to petition it and go through a certain procedure, one of which involves like a 60-day sort of a period of time and review. You don't need to know that much. But changing laws is not as simple as, hey, let's just erase it and rewrite it. What sorts of things can they do to us when we get in trouble? What is their disciplinary action list? Reprimand, the big one. Well, it's not a big one. It's a common one. It's the smallest of the four. Censure is another one, but kind of not. But you might see that on the test. It's sort of like reprimand. Suspension, we see a lot. Revocation is the big, bad, ugly one. We don't need you anymore. Please leave the business. I'm glad I didn't see the one that starts with an F, because they don't fine us. Good job. Well done. In CE classes, they say it all the time. 10, 12-year agents, 20-year agents forget, and they think they can be fined. There is one type of licensee that could be fined. There it is. The fine is only for timeshare developers. Good job. How much is that fine per violation for timeshare developers if they violate the Timeshare Act? $500 per violation. Good job. And that would be the developer who got fined, not the salesperson that works for the developer. Although the salesperson needs a license too. Timeshare salesperson needs a license, but if they did something wrong, the developer likely would get the fine and the salesperson would get the other type of disciplinary action, reprimand, suspension, revocation if it's bad enough. What is it called when the real estate commission goes after someone that they catch doing real estate without a license? They pursue in a court of law to get somebody to stop trying to do real estate without a license. They sue them for this 2-word phrase that, I don't know, might just appear before your eyes in your memory if you were to imagine what this word could be in bold. There you go. Injunctive relief is when they are appealing to the superior court to say, hey, we got word that this person over here is bird dogging for an investor. The word bird dog means somebody out there trying to find deals. If they're getting paid to find those deals and talk to potential sellers, that's not too far off from doing real estate without a license and getting paid for it. They're finding a property for an investor for money. When you try to find property for someone else for money, that requires a license. And at some point, if they do it enough, they might run across somebody like when they called me one time on my listing, and I kept asking questions to qualify them, try to figure out, wait, what am I dealing with here, an agent or a buyer, potential buyer? No, I'm just looking for asking questions, and I'm going to pass it off if it sounds like a good opportunity for an investor that I work with. Oh, are you the investor? No, I'm just finding the deal, and then I'll let them know about it. Well, sir, if you're doing this for money, as like a bird dog kind of situation, then you need a license for that. And then the phone went dead. He hung up. So there it is. Yeah, Will says, isn't that a type of wholesaling? It could be. And that's part of the reason that wholesaling made it into the continuing ed course this year. They specifically say there is a type of wholesaling that is frankly doing real estate without a license. So watch out. So you got that exactly right. If you're doing something, real estate for another, for compensation, you could be breaking the law. and then the real estate commission could come after for conjunctive relief. There is another kind of wholesaling that where what? You are the investor. And so you are looking for deals, putting out those yellow bandit signs at the intersections. Call me if you need to sell, fast money for houses, stuff like that. Trying to find a desperate seller situation, and you find them and you lock them into a contract. Okay, so far we're so far so good. We haven't broken any laws yet. Get them in a contract, and that contract should say that you might assign it to someone else. You could assign it to another investor. So far so good. That investor could go through with the sale. But if you got carried away and tried to advertise the property to the final buyer before you're the actual owner, now you've done some real estate without a license. Don't advertise for your final buyer until you are the actual owner. That's where people do go wrong and can get in trouble. Another way. Then we get into the big ones about misrepresentation and omission. So get real good with this. I think you guys had a pretty firm grasp on it. Misrepresentation is what? What's misrepresentation compared to omission? Misrepresentation means you did what? Misrepresentation. Let me give you some choices. If you misrepresented, you said something incorrect. Or what? You kept your mouth shut. Which one, A or B? If you misrepresented, did you, yeah, there it is. Deborah says, gave inaccurate information. Now, be careful not to mix them up. Sometimes seeing some things that are willful versus negligent, right? So it's two separate tests. It's, are we dealing with misrepresentation or omission? And then after you figure that out, think, okay, did they do it willfully or negligently? So don't let that kind of twist you up when you're trying to dissect a problem. To first of all think, did they keep their mouth shut when they should have said something? In which case it would be omission. Or did they say a thing that turned out to be wrong? In which case it would be misrepresentation. Now that you know which one of those it is, you can answer the question, did they do it on purpose or did they do it because they were lazy or slack and didn't bother to do the research, which would be negligence. So if you know for a fact because you've done the research and you know houses are selling for $350,000, the one in question that you're on the listing appointment for, compared to other things that have sold, should be worth around $350,000, should probably sell for that. But you go ahead and list it for $400 because the seller won't let you have the listing unless you do so. Is that an example of one of these things, and which one might it be? You did your research, you know it says $350, probably what it's going to sell for, but the seller says, before you have a chance to really go into it, the seller says, well, I was thinking we'd list it at $400 or $410 and try to sell it for $400. Oh yeah, that should work. We could probably get $400 for that, because if you don't say that, you also know they're interviewing 4 other people and one of them might do it first and end up getting the listing and not you. So yeah, you told them something incorrect on purpose. And you also probably guilty of self-dealing almost, because you're putting yourself ahead of them in a way. This is probably bad enough, but anytime you put yourself ahead of the client, that's another one called self-dealing. Typically the self-dealing one is you maybe keeping your mouth shut on that listing appointment and not telling them that you might actually want to buy it. That would be a more blatant example of self-dealing. What sorts of things are material facts that could get you in trouble with these willful and negligent misrepresentation and omission scenarios. Flood zones, there you go. The property itself. A lot of people, when we talk about material facts, first think of the property itself. What's wrong with it? What repairs are needed? Rotten windows, leaky roof. But Victor says it could also be something related to the property. Not the property itself, but down the street or in the area, like zoning. Zoning rules, covenants and restriction rules. New highway coming through. What's another type of material fact besides related to the property or the area down the road? Think about a contract situation. We're under contract. What could you find out about that while under contract that would, there it is, the ability to perform, funds not coming, right? Buyer's loan did not get approved. That's a material fact. You better stop everything you're doing and hurry up and tell the other party. You're the buyer agent. You just got this horrible call from the lender and the buyer, all in a panic. You need to tell that listing agent because now that buyer is unable to perform. A lot of times that can be salvaged, by the way. There might be another lender that could pull it off. So the parties will try to work together usually to figure out, is there another lender that can work with this problem that they've encountered? Maybe it's a ratio problem, right? They can't quite qualify under the back end ratio. They exceed the FHA back end 43%. But I had one lady who that was the case of and found a lender that was willing to consider some of her income in a way that fit within the 43%. As long as the lender's okay with it, I'm okay with it. And then finally, what's the fourth category of material fact that's sort of all-encompassing? We had about the property, we had related to the property, we have ability to perform, and then fourth, it might be somebody with a pet allergy. It might be somebody who doesn't want any termite damage ever, even if it's been treated and it was just the most minimal possible. It could be that it's barely in the city limits, even though it looks like the country, but the city limits are just within it. It could be anything. Anything that's what? Important to them. If it's important to them, it's a material fact that you have to adhere to. So if your buyer says, I don't want to buy a property that's ever had termite damage, even if it's all fixed and repaired and better than it used to be before, because it ever had the termites, that's all it is. It's enough for me, and it makes it a material fact that you have to follow. That's an easy one to miss on the test, right? And a big one, another big one is presence of pets, right? Pets in the property because of some people's allergies are so super sensitive to pet dander. Just because it ever had a pet, even though they had the carpets cleaned. If that's important to them, you got to tell them. What are the three kinds of properties that are a stigmatized property? What are the three examples of stigmatized property? Meaning not material facts that must be disclosed. You got it. Death or suicide in the property, haunted house, and then finally, sex offender nearby. None of those are material facts. Those are all stigmatized property related categories. And so if you're the listing agent and the buyer agent calls you and says, hey, did somebody die in that house? What are your choices? You are presented with this question. They ask it, what do you do? What could you do? What could you say? You could honestly, truthfully say, I have no idea. That's true. But what if you did know for sure? And that's even the reason you're helping the seller sell it, because you want to help them get out of there. They just can't handle living there anymore because they lost a dear loved one. There it is. Your choice. I would say find out from your seller how they want you to proceed. And if you do choose to answer it and tell what happened or tell that someone died, you can't lie about it. You could also say, I'm not going to answer that question, or somehow or other, in a better, smoother way, decline or refuse to answer. That is allowable. Sometimes that in and of itself is an answer. Say again? Yeah, right. Sure. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So no owning a house with that kind of history for you. Okay, so there you go. There you go. So it's tied in with the whole haunted thing, huh? Gotcha. And if it's haunted by the death of a convicted sex offender, it's all the worse. Even worse, for sure. What are the kinds of material facts that are always required to be disclosed? There are three of those. Three material facts that you have to disclose. What could go on with that house? There it is. A certain kind of stucco. Be careful about that. It'd be the synthetic stucco, not the hard coat or real stucco. That's not the problem. Synthetic stucco, also called EIFS stucco. Yeah, well, lead-based paint, sort of. If it's built before 78, you have to report that it might have it, but you aren't required to test for it and prove that it's there. So the answers I'm looking for there that you might run into is synthetic stucco. Yeah, polybutylene pipes that have leaked, not just because it's got the poly pipes, but if they've leaked, now that has to be disclosed. And then the third one is my favorite, Walter White, Breaking Bad. Ever used for meth production, the production of methamphetamine. The asbestos, no. That is certainly an environmental hazard, but you aren't required to test for it. That's the difference. You're not required to test for synthetic stucco either, but you've got to disclose it if it ever had synthetic stucco. Here's the issue with that. Some people took all of it off. But even though they took all of it off, it still has to be disclosed that it used to have it, because it might still have the moisture damage still going on under the surface. They took it all off and they bricked up in its place, but the problem is it let moisture in, and that moisture might still be maintained at a certain level and therefore still be causing damage. But the other things like asbestos and radon, those are up to the buyer to test for and dig into it as deeply as they want to get to the bottom of it. The three, though, are synthetic stucco, poly pipes that have leaked, and methamphetamine being produced in the house. When we come back from break, we'll talk about a couple more of these, go a little more into the comment section, then we'll hop on over to valuation. I'll see you back here in 10. Welcome back. There we go. Let's dive in a little bit more, do a little bit more review of this comment section. False promises. That's a big one in any sales job. But in this sales job, we have the commission overseeing us, making sure that we don't do this stuff wrong. And so an agent promising something like, in this case, this example, apartment getting repainted and it doesn't actually get repainted, we could get in trouble for that. That's a good thing. To make sure that we fulfill promises made to clients. Undisclosed dual agency, we got into that in 7 and 8. We can't act like a dual agent without everybody giving us permission to do so. Can't be one without permission. Disclosure and permission. So in this case, house listed with firm X, showing the house to a prospective buyer not represented by firm X, the agent advises the buyer to offer less than asking price. They're acting like a dual agent without permission, because they are showing it to a buyer that they've not been hired by yet. The agent and the firm are contractually obligated to represent only the seller, but they are looking out more for the buyer than the seller by giving a suggestion of a lower than asking price offer. We are allowed to dual affiliate. We can work under two or more than one broker, but both of those brokers in charge must know about it. And as a provisional broker, you can't dually affiliate. You don't have that option, but a full broker does. So you could be working for one that you affiliate with at the beach because you are there half the year, and then also at the mountains. Or one of them in your hometown for sales and another one for property management. Or one of them for sales and another one is your own that you've set up to do property management. Because you're a salesperson, sales BIC, the firm you do sales under, that BIC won't allow you to do property management under them. But as long as they're cool with it, you could start your own firm that you do the property management under. And if you did not have that consent and permission, then you'd be violating this license law. Improper brokerage commission. You can't pay an unlicensed person for doing stuff that requires a license. Incompetence and unworthiness. We see this under that old car, reasonable skill and care. Gotta know what you're doing. That's going to fall largely on the shoulders of the BIC that you affiliate with. You're learning the laws and rules, but knowing actually how to do the business, we're not covering that part here. Doing the business, that's going to be something you learn in your on-the-job training and your boot camp, if they have something like that, or some sort of orientation. But all of that involves things like filling out the forms properly, performing the services that you've been hired to perform, providing accurate closing statements. Oh, wow, that's timely. We just talked all about that, didn't we? So failure to provide accurate closing statements could result in being guilty of unworthiness and incompetence. In other words, knowing how to do the math to make sure that the calculation for tax proration is accurate, or interim interest, or anything related to the contract coming over to the closing disclosure, making sure all that made it properly, got included. Just because it's a paralegal and an attorney and a special software that they use where they're just plugging in the numbers, it doesn't mean the numbers got plugged into the right place. I've had it happen where what was supposed to be a paying off of an existing credit line became a let's give the money to the other party because they put it in the wrong box. So you have to catch things like that. Improper dealing. Agent help as a buyer with fraud in connection with the mortgage loan application by preparing two contracts, one with false information and another that's the accurate one that's going to get turned into the lender. Sorry, the false one would get turned into the lender, but then there's the accurate one. So dual contracting, any sort of just fraud type of behavior. Discriminatory practices, that's a big one. We'll learn more about that in Chapter 19. Mostly that's about violating fair housing. And then ultimately, practice of law. We get warned about that all through the contract in those instructional blue boxes. Don't draft legal documents. Don't write deeds or addenda or amendments or contracts from scratch. We're allowed to fill in the blanks. That's it. There's a section here starting on page 10 about agency, which kind of crosses over with what we learned in Chapter 7 and 8. So now that you've studied Chapter 7 and 8, if you haven't looked through the comments section since before we got to that, you might want to read through these couple of pages and think about what we learned in our agency chapters. What sorts of things have to be in all agency agreements? What has to be in every agency agreement you sign with a client? Can you call yourself, I'm your realtor for life? Sure, you can advertise with that, but you can't expect to actually be that. You can't make them sign something that lets you actually do that. You got to win every piece every time, right? You got to have that expiration date, Deborah says. Yeah, a definitive period of time. The only exception is property management could have a built-in automatic renewal, because that'd be sort of a pain. As long as you're happy with how that person's managing your property, let's just let them keep doing it. And then fire them if they go off the rails. But besides that, all other kinds of agency cannot have an automatic renewal. Non-discrimination language needs to be conspicuous and a very specific paragraph, and we saw that in a couple of places. And then also the license number of that licensee. Notice that this is what the commission says has to be in every agency agreement, but what we also saw were a lot of other things in those agency agreements, including the license number of the firm. But it's the one of the licensee that the commission has here that's required. It talks about oral / non-written agency, and we are allowed to do that for a limited time, however long it takes us to write an offer. As soon as we write an offer, got to convert that to writing. And then it talks about the working with agents disclosure. When is it required? When is that working with agents disclosure a requirement to be disclosed? What's the topics of conversation that could arise there it is. Thank you. You guys are good. Money or motivation. That's the first substantial contact. What about if you walk into an open house and that agent there says, "Hi, my name is Victoria." Does she now need to tell you all about how agency works? No. That would be first initial contact. Now, there is something in the business that is triggered by first initial contact. You've got to disclose your role at first initial contact in a couple of situations. One of those is when you're meeting the seller. If you're a buyer agent showing up a little early to a showing, seller's still there, they're packing up the car, trying to get the kids out of there. "Oh, hi, I'm the buyer agent. I'll get out of your hair till you're gone. No rush. My client's not here yet." You would need to go ahead and let them know who you are, that you represent that buyer. Or if you call the listing agent and say, "Hey, I just showed your listing. I'm the buyer agent for the person and might be interested in writing an offer. Had a couple questions." It's also kind of handled in the contract on the second to last page where we talk about, here's how I want you to contact me through this negotiation. And oh, by the way, I'm a dual agent, or I'm a buyer agent, or I'm a listing agent. All those potential things are addressed there. But for the most part, when we're dealing with brand new people that we potential clients, we're looking for this moment of first substantial contact. You want to hit them before they start talking about real money and real motivation. What if they say, "I'd kind of like to be in a place before the end of the year"? Does that qualify as first substantial contact? Kind of like to be in place by the end of the year. That's not enough, is it? It's not enough information. What if they say, "My job is moving me in October. I got to be out of here by then"? Now that's more firm. That's more of a deadline, motivation. That could affect their selling price. Because sometimes when the company's moving, the company's willing to buy you out so you can go ahead and get moved, but that buyout's possibly less than what you could sell it for without the company buying you out. So you're motivated to get it sold first before you have to take that buyout. That's the sort of example where that could apply. What if they say, "I'm paying cash and I'm getting $411,000 from my grandmother's estate when it closes in 3 weeks"? There's pretty hardcore defined money limitation. Yeah. Or, "I've already been pre-approved. I've talked to Rocket Mortgage online and they told me I qualify for $850,000. You've got a money situation. You've got a pre-approval amount. Or if they say, "I'd kind of like to have payments under $2,000. That's a wish, not a limitation. It's more of a looking for this, but you don't know what they can really qualify for yet because they haven't been pre-approved yet. When that first substantial contact happens, now you've got to tell them some things. What sorts of things are you telling them? "Hey, before we go further with this conversation, I need to share some stuff with you." And what are those things? Yeah, their choices. First of all, what are you right now? What role do you occupy right now? And then also, what are their options for hiring you? Who do you represent at this moment? You always represent someone. And if it's at an open house, you might either represent the seller themselves, or you might have adopted that open house from another agent, but you at the very least are in the same firm as the one representing that seller. So you need to let them know what the deal is so they'll know to keep their mouth shut, essentially, really what it comes down to. But here's the good news, brand new potential buyer that I'm just meeting. You could hire me, and here's how. Lots of different ways you could say it, right? Some people kind of shy away from it. The main thing is that you at least address it somehow. Put your spin on it. And if you recall, the Real Estate Commission has a YouTube channel, and the guy in the blue shirt goes through and explains, if you haven't already watched his version of the working with agents disclosure for buyers versus sellers. Take a look at that. See what he says about it. It's coming straight from the Real Estate Commission. But my version is something like this. Okay, so before we go further, I don't want to do anything that causes you to be harmed. So I want to make sure that you understand how all this works. Right now, I work for the seller. They've hired me to sell this house that you've called me about. So don't tell me anything yet that you might not want the seller to know. You'll notice I said the word yet, because there could be a moment at which you could go ahead and tell me that and not worry about me disclosing it. That would be a case of something called dual agency. This seller has given me permission to be a dual agent, and my firm is willing to let me do it, and I'm okay with it too. So if you agree with what I'm about to explain to you, I could be the only agent involved in this transaction. If you want to buy this house and you allow me to be a dual agent, then I could look out for your best interest, but I'm while also looking out for the sellers. And I know that sounds weird and almost impossible, but here's how that works. As a dual agent, I can't tell you the lowest the seller might come down to. I also can't tell them the most you might be willing to pay if you were to share that with me. I keep your secrets from each other. But here's the downside of dual agency. I get right in front of that bus, guys. I want them to know I'm not trying to talk you into a thing. I'd really rather you not even do it. I don't care. In fact, there's some agents that won't touch it because it's so potentially awkward. But if it makes or breaks a sale, and that's in the best interest of the parties, I'll do it. And so I'll say, I can't be more loyal to one of you than the other. I met the seller first. I just met you today. That's irrelevant. I can't give the seller more preferential treatment than I give you, or vice versa. I might like you more, but I still can't help you more than I help the seller. That's the limitation of dual agency. And if you don't like that, we have some other choices. And at this point in real life, I'm not just cramming all this in their face. I'm like pausing for, oh, does that make sense? Do you have questions? I'm kind of getting some interaction, right? It's going to be more conversational. By the way, oh, you say you don't like the sound of that? Well, I have one more choice. We could still keep this within our firm, and I could connect you with a good broker in our firm to represent you while I stay on the side of the seller. Again, this whole time, don't want you to tell me anything you wouldn't want to tell the seller directly. In that case, the loyalty can come back in to the picture. Now we have this thing called designated dual agency. And it's like dual agency, but better because you have your own agent and the seller has me, their own agent. And now we can treat it like it's two separate firms again. So they're literally explaining this stuff. There are plenty of agents who don't do it properly. Or they just kind of gloss over it. And there's many times when I'm explaining it and they say, well, the last agent I talked to didn't even mention this. And I somehow usually subtly try to get into the point, well, don't you want to work with somebody that knows the laws and rules? I might not be that blatant, but that's sort of an idea, right? Sometimes they put those pieces together. Sometimes they already figure that out and it doesn't even have to be said and I win because the other person was too timid, I guess, to maybe bring it up. But it's really it's the approach, how you position it. This is big out there in the real world, in the wild. This is huge. Your BIC is really going to impress this hard and make sure that you can talk through this. They might even have you do role plays so that you can get this down and explain it. I've heard some really good and some really bad. You'll also cover it in post-licensing 301. And usually in that class, I will put you in breakout rooms and let you kind of role play with 2 to 4 classmates. Depends on how big the class is. And that's when you're really put to the test. You're like, oh, crap. Now I have to actually say the words to a person who knows how this should sound. It's easier in front of a rank potential buyer or seller because they don't know. It's tough when it's in front of a colleague or your BIC because they know what you should be saying. But that's the good part. That's where you get real good real fast. Some good stuff about agency in these couple of pages, so make sure that you read through that. A couple things about advertising. What is it called when you don't have your firm name in the ad? What kind of ad is that? A blind ad, meaning you're coming across as the actual seller, which is a great way to get better leads, but it's just not allowed. So we have to admit that we're a broker. Has to be in the ad. In fact, as a provisional broker, you've also got to put the firm's phone number as well as the firm name. But just not having the firm name at all is a blind ad. On the test, they like to give you some sample ad verbiage, ABCD. Pick the one that's not the blind ad or pick the one that is. When do we have to deliver anything our customer signs? Within how many days do we have to deliver any instruments involved? 3 days. We see a lot of 3 days in this business. Can we get paid from a party that has adverse interests to our client? Can we get paid to someone with adverse interests to our client? Sure, but with what requirement? Yeah. Client's got to know about it, got to be okay with it. Permission, disclosure, you got it. How long do we have to keep all records of a transaction? How many years? We're talking about years of keeping records of a transaction. Only 3. Got to keep them for 3 years. That's the real estate requirement, the commission requirement. Probably not a bad idea to keep them for longer, because if something did come up in terms of litigation, lawsuit years down the line, it might have been good that you had those records to prove your position, prove something that you did right. So that's just legal advice, but the real estate commission bare minimum requirement is 3 years. How can that record keeping take place? 3 years of keeping the records. Does it have to be in writing? Does it have to be electronic? Does it have to be one of each? How can you keep and retain those records? Either or both. Either one, probably good to be redundant, probably good to have maybe one of each or a couple different places, somewhere in the cloud, maybe also on a zip drive. What happens if you are in a dispute with another realtor? You and another realtor think that you're the procuring cause and you want to fight about it. Should you call the real estate commission? They don't care. The real estate commission is not the place to go for a realtor to realtor dispute. Yeah, your BICS will help you with that. What if it's an in-house thing, you might keep it in-house, keep your dirty laundry a secret. But if it's a 2 different firm kind of a thing, what group can help you dispute a firm-to-firm dispute? Yeah, the association, the local board, the local realtor association. You're both realtors, so they would probably put together some sort of an arbitration, maybe a hearing of some sort. It's just that if it's an in-house situation, I have a feeling your BIC's going to really want to try to keep it in-house, but that's up to you. You're a member of the Realtor Association, and you could pursue that dispute outside of the firm. When do we have to report a name or number or email change to the commission? How many days do we have to report that we changed our name because we got married or changed our address because we moved? We have 10 days. Well done. What about that we were arrested for drunk driving? How long do we have to tell the commission that we were arrested for drunk driving? That's the sneaky, tricky one, isn't it? You could answer it this way: 60 days from the point that that arrest turns into a conviction, because it's not about the arrest or the accusation. It's about conviction. If you're convicted of a crime, you have 60 days to disclose that. The arrest, don't have to disclose that. You may have been it may be a false arrest, maybe nothing's proven yet, right? You were arrested, but not yet convicted. Here's some talk that we kind of were getting into with closings about TRID, TILA, RESPA integrated disclosures, and the thing about us being responsible for closing statements. We have to deliver to our client an accurate closing statement. That's going to be generated by the closing attorney's office, but you've got to verify that it's error free. You've got to review it for accuracy. It needs to be accurate and a copy given to each party, and you need to make sure all that happens. Some of the parts of that closing disclosure are not your responsibility. Give me an example of something you are not required to verify on the closing disclosure that you really have no way to verify. What sorts of entries on a CD do not fall in your responsibility list? Sheena sums it up in one word. That's perfect. Loan-related things. Yeah. You don't know what that lender charges for discount points or for origination fee. That's not on your shoulders. But the price, was that right? The commission rate, was that in there right? Maybe that got changed as part of the negotiating. We had a price change because of the repair negotiations. The siding was rotten, therefore we're going to drop the price by $10,000. Did that get updated and told to the attorney? That's a big part where this goes wrong. You have the original contract, which you sent in to the closing attorney, but then 3 weeks later, you're negotiating repairs and you make a significant adjustment with an amendment, like now the seller's going to pay money toward the buyer's closing costs, or we're going to drop the price. You better make sure to include the attorney and let them know about that change, because they need to know to change the numbers on the closing disclosure. And of course, the lender. Sometimes that gets overlooked and you're there at the last minute and the attorney's like, well, you get the closing disclosure and you're like, wait, it still says 515. It should say 505. And the attorney says, well, we didn't know. You didn't tell us. And you're like, oh no, I was supposed to tell you. You needed to have sent the amendment to the contract that shows we've changed the price from 515 down to 505. You don't need to tell them why. You just need to tell them that that happened so that they will write it properly and put it in the closing. It's not for you. You can't go in that closing disclosure and make the change yourself. You've got to tell the attorney, here's what's wrong. Please fix it. Sometimes the corrections are their fault and they put something in the wrong place, but it doesn't matter. Just get it fixed. Catch it because you reviewed it properly and let them know what needs to be fixed. It says, review and confirm all charges and credits have been properly debited or credited to the right people and in the correct columns, and review and confirm the accuracy of the calculations for things that we are familiar with now from last week. Prorated items for taxes, for instance, maybe also HOA, dues, maybe rent, and reserves for setting up the escrows, and interim interest, and excise tax, and the bottom line figures. The things that happen in what I call the monster problem. What's the amount the buyer needs to bring to closing? Or what's the amount the seller's going to get from closing? And if you know of some sort of an expense paid by a third party, not included, you've got to notify the attorney and the lender of the omission. You know what we're talking about here, guys? This is a big one. I think of Martha Stewart because she served time in West Virginia prison, and that's where the loan fraud people go. Martha Stewart prison, I call it. This loan fraud stuff. Somebody's trying to leave some number off the closing statement, a closing settlement statement, It might be because they're up to no good. And a lot of that happened in years up to 2008. You had dirty appraisers and dirty lenders and dirty brokers. Dirty lender? Wait, isn't it their money? No. They're the ones handling the loan, but the money is the investor's money. And the investor is who they are trying to defraud. Could be all parties or just a few of the parties. Maybe the appraiser is in on it and they're trying to give it a higher than real value. And they're going to somehow split the amount of money they defraud the investor into loaning. Investor thinks it's worth $400, but it's actually worth $350. So it's really getting around to that. That's what this little part's talking about. You need to make sure that everything involved in that transaction is included and disclosed. That's why the other day when the other agent and my recent one said, how are we going to handle this price adjustment or closing cost paid by seller in lieu of repairs? Should we drop the price or should we have them pay some closing costs? My first reaction was check with your lender. It's a newer agent. So I just told her, first step, let's see what the lender prefers, because that rules everything. The golden rule. They who have the gold makes the rules. What does the lender want it to be? Which one? And then the next thing is when the attorney next week probably finishes the closing disclosure and sends it to me, I'm going to make sure that thing that we ended up doing got done and that all those figures are accurate and correct. And broker should notify the settlement agent if they believe there are any errors or omissions on that statement. And if you don't, and then something goes sideways and people get accused of loan fraud, you might be included in those accusations. Broker must confirm all accuracy of all entries about which they have direct knowledge. Sale price, due diligence, earnest, commissions, amounts due, credits, closing costs paid by. This part, as to amounts paid by or due third parties, like the other side of the transaction, you may not know that. So you can assume that the amounts for charges stated on the settlement statement are right unless there's some reason for you to suspect otherwise. If you were the one involved because it was your buyer who asked for the seller to provide a warranty, if you're the listing agent and the other side asked for your seller to provide a warranty, probably your responsibility was to find out from the seller, what warranty company do you want to use, and to set that up. Order the warranty so that it's in place as of closing for that year for that buyer. And so that's the sort of thing that you would have to know about and make sure that the attorney knows, seller's paying $600 for a home buyer's warranty. Here's the invoice proving that the warranty has been ordered, and now the attorney has it so that they can send that check in from the proceeds of the sale as well. They talk about TRID rule becoming effective in 2015. So it replaced what we used before. What we used before was the HUD-1 settlement statement. But what it replaced it for was for loan-related closings. TRID, TILA RESPA integrated disclosure, the thing I showed you that looks a lot like the loan estimate, that's the TRID required disclosure. The HUD-1 version is what we used before that, and we still do when it's a cash sale. So when it's a cash sale, the TRID version is not what we use. That's only required for loan-related closings. And there's a decent percentage of closings that are cash sales. So in those cash sales, it's not the TRID form, it's the HUD-1 form. Closing disclosures are disclosures not equivalent to a settlement statement. The HUD-1 is no longer used in TRID-governed transactions. Other kinds of settlement statements may be used. There's another one called an ALTA. Sometimes they'll have both. They'll have a TRID version and an ALTA version. It's just different versions of the closing statements. And there you go. HUD-1 may still be used as the settlement statement when it's a non-TRID governed transaction like cash or construction loan or investment property, but mostly you'll run into it in a cash transaction. So when you see that, that's what they're talking about. We talked about trust funds, trust money, trust accounts, and that's money where it's a place where we put other people's money. When do we have to put it in the trust account if our firm has the trust account? How many days? It's another 3, but the question is 3 days from when? And so if we scroll down to here, handling trust money, any trust money received by a licensee has to be deposited within 3 banking days of receipt. The only exception is received when you get that earnest money included with the offer to purchase and tenant security deposits along with a lease. It's got to be deposited not later than 3 banking days following acceptance of the offer. If it's cash, you've got to put it in following receipt no matter what, because you can't just carry around other people's cash. Let's see. We're going to get into this last little bit in the next section, CMAs and BPOs. But just notice, after we study that tonight, go back and read this last couple of pages of the comment section and see how they compare. But again, always refer back to the syllabus. Hopefully you're still doing that and you're filling out a printed version with definitions of things. All that stuff that we just talked about and went through, turn this into a study guide for yourself. Okay. We talked about closing the transaction. Let's get into valuation. There we go. Okay, there we are. So valuation, we're going to talk a lot about this it's the difference between what an appraiser does and what we as brokers do. But we both do kind of very similar stuff. It's just that the appraiser does is called a little differently than the thing that we do. Because who do you think is better at it? Is better at figuring out what things are worth? You bet. The appraiser. Sorry, let me try this again. And we're going to learn about what the appraiser's version is called, what our version is called, how the appraiser is overseen, who oversees the appraiser and their work. Sometimes appraisers don't know what they're doing. Sometimes we don't know what we're doing. But it's not just automatic that the appraiser does a good job. And so who do you turn them into if they don't do a good job? The appraisal board is who oversees appraisers, and what are they looking for? That appraiser has to find some comparable sales. There are three different ways that appraisers determine value. So we'll learn about how they do that valuation. And one of them, each of them applies to different types of property. So our objectives here are to understand how valuation is determined. Learn some definitions and the process of being an appraiser, learn the various approaches, the sales approach, which is what we use mostly as a broker, the cost approach, which is something we use for very unique properties, and the income approach, which is for, surprise, drum roll, income properties. If it's a rental property, we're not going to use the same method of determining its value. We'll learn about why. And this appraisal method of reconciliation, as well as calculating values. So who can do what different things? Who can do stuff? Appraisers do appraisals. Provisional and non-provisional brokers do one of two things, either a comparative or comparable market analysis, a CMA, competitive market analysis. You could see it any of those different terms, but a CMA is what we brokers do to determine, here's the catch point. Don't use the wrong word out there in the wild. The commission doesn't like it when we say we're going to determine the value of your property. We brokers don't determine value. We brokers determine probable sale price. The sale price it probably will sell for. That's what we have to call the thing that we are looking for when we do our market analysis. So what is a broker looking for? What do they do? Not an appraisal, not a market value, but a probable sale price. So both provisional and non-provisional brokers would use and complete a CMA or another document called a BPO, a broker's price opinion, BPO. So either a CMA or a BPO. We'll learn what the differences in those two things are here in a minute. What are some factors that affect value? We're going to learn about that, as well as some basic economic principles of value. We're going to learn these different approaches. I need to make those a little bit better, more legible. But the sales comparison approach, the cost approach, and the income approach. Let's start with some terms. Market value is the thing the appraiser comes up with, and it's the estimated price that a buyer will pay and a seller will accept. That's the market value. What the appraiser thinks it's going to sell for. The market price is the thing it actually did sell for. So notice the difference there is value versus price. When you see the word price, just think sales price. That's what it sold for. So the market price is the sale price. It's the actual price that it sold for. That means they closed. There were some closed properties similar to this one. What did they close for? That's what the appraiser wants to look at to determine the appraised value or the market value of the subject property. That's another term. The subject property is the one you're trying to list if you're the broker, or the one the appraiser is trying to determine the value of. The property in question, subject property. What do you use to figure out for that appraiser? What is the appraiser using to figure out what that subject property is worth? You tell me. There it is. Yeah, Corey says comparable properties, things that sold already. The best predictor of what something is worth is what people have been willing to pay for similar properties. So we've got to learn how to pick good comps. Your market analysis, or for the appraiser, the appraisal is only as good as the comps they used. You can't just pick 3 random properties in the whole city. Obviously, some are commercial, some are big houses, some are little houses. They need to match up as closely as you can find to the one that is the subject property. And one of those most important criteria is what? What do you think is the most important criteria when you're looking for comparable properties to compare the subject property to? What do you think is some of the important things to pay attention to? The area it's in, that's a good one. Don't compare one side of the city to another. Don't pick a comp 20 miles away. An appraiser would never do that. And we as brokers need to try to emulate what an appraiser does as much as we can. We can't call it the same terms, but we need to get good like an appraiser's good. Yeah, square footage, size, finishes, size of lot, those are good ones. All of those have to do with physical features. What's one element? There it is. Kirsty got down to it. When did that sale of that comp happen? That's huge. We don't want a 2-year-old comp. I had a repeat client. She had used me to buy her first little townhouse. We got it sold. I helped her buy her first single family house. And when she bought that one, she was still about 28. Their parents were very helpful and involved, and that's great. That's fine. But 2 days after the contract was written, this was back when the market was starting to explode, and that house was asking price $195. And because of, oh my goodness, buckle your seatbelts, we had like 2 other competing offers. Oh, damn, crazy. We didn't know what was coming. Lucky for her, that's all we were dealing with back then. But we had to go all the way up to $196,000 to win this contract and be the best one. And we won. But her dad had a few things to say the next day. She called me crying one day. The next day, she said, "My dad thinks I'm overpaying." And I'm like, do tell. He didn't go with us to the showing. He didn't make his presence known during the offers, which was all fine with me. But he had done some research, and he was determining that we were vastly overpaying. And I said, that's fine. I'm glad you have a support system. Just curious, what's he basing it on? And she said, well, I'll check. And he sent her the comps he was using, which he pulled from Zillow and Realtor.com. And that's fine too, except they were 1 and 2 years old. They were 1 and 2 years old. They were 1 and 2 years old. That is too old. And so I had the great pleasure of saying, here's the good news. Those comps would never be used by an appraiser. The ones that I used before we wrote our offer, hint, hint, I did it right, was the ones that are most current. It helped a lot the next week when one right down the street that was very similar closed for $205. Dad got on board real quick. He realized this 2-year-old Zillow comp doesn't matter. It's irrelevant because the market is vastly different now than it was 2 years earlier. So that's huge. And that's very testable. Probably the number one trait for a comp is, when did it close? Number 2 is area. How close is it? Let's try to keep it in the same neighborhood if at all possible. Sometimes that's not possible though. Because how could it? They're not always the case that there's 3 comps in the neighborhood in the moment you need them. So we'll talk about what we do when that happens. Here's another term. This one is fun. What's cost? That's what the seller spent. Past expenditures, things that they've done to the property. So if a seller put on a big custom deck that they built themselves, they and their son, they went out there every Saturday for 6 months and worked on this deck, and you're out there on the listing appointment and you say, "Hey seller, wow, I'm really impressed. This deck is enormous and it's really impressive. You did a great job. And I appreciate how you carved your wife's face into the post there on the stairs, and you've written all your grandkids' names, and it's so impressive." "I know. Don't you think I did a great job?" "Yeah, you did a great job." "Well, I know the one down the street of the same floor plan sold for $300, and everything else is the same, but they don't have a deck like this. They have a deck the same size, but not this nice. I used gold-plated screws, so I think mine is worth $350. They always think theirs is worth more when they did the work, right? So you have to have this discussion about cost. What you spent might not translate to value or what it probably will sell for necessarily. What did they do? They might have fixed up the kitchen, might have fixed up the bath, upgrades, did the tile work themselves, and it shows because they didn't use a straight edge maybe, but they think it's worth more. So that's a big discussion that we have to have with them. Help them understand it and blame the other guy, not yourself. It's not your fault that it's not worth as much. The way you say that is, I'm going to share with you what similar properties in this neighborhood have sold for, and we'll just have to, and we'll explore together what buyers are willing to pay for houses like yours. And then I show them pictures and let them see it. Oh, wow. I didn't know the inside of that house down the street looked like that. That looks way better than mine. I know. I'm going to keep that to myself, but I'm glad you realized this. And so now you can see that maybe your estimate of value is a little more overpriced than it needs to be. And then I'll explain to them, look, the price we think it'll sell for is based on comparables because that's what an appraiser is going to do. We've got to pass several tests along the way. First of all, we have to price it correctly so that we can get offers. Once we get that and get it under contract, it's got to pass the appraiser test if it's a lender-related sale. If it's a cash sale, they probably won't get an appraisal. But most of them are not cash sales. So we got to pass the appraiser's opinion too. So it's important to get this thing right. And then it comes down to how much will it adjust for if the appraiser decides that it's not worth the contract price? How much do you have to deal with then? So it's real important to help them understand this valuation thing in the beginning so as to avoid all that, the fun stuff. We'll talk more about that when I see you back here in 10 minutes. Let's bring it on back together. There we go. Okay, let's keep on talking about valuations. There's those three ways to report valuation. We've got appraisal. That's done by who? Who does the appraisals? You might actually see a question like that, guys. Who does appraisals? There you go. Sometimes the answer is so simple you doubt it. You doubt yourself. Yeah. And it's because of this. The commission doesn't want us out there saying to the seller, hey, seller, looking forward to our listing appointment tomorrow night at 6. I will give you an appraisal for your market value. That would be wrong in all kinds of ways. So they're really pushing and belaboring that point. The thing that we provide those clients when we do a listing appointment is not an appraisal. That's done by appraisers. By the way, when it's your listing and you find out the appraiser wants to go out and see it and do the appraisal when you're under contract, probably about the second or third week, go do it with them. Don't do it with them, but go watch them. Go meet them out there. It's allowable. What you can't do is intimidate, bribe, coerce, and say, you better bring this in at value, or none of that. But you are encouraged and allowed to plead your case and help them have all the info they need to do a good job of getting the most value for that listing for your client's house as you possibly can. Here's why. It is so much harder to appeal an appraisal after it's already been created and published, printed. It's next to impossible. So much easier to tell them in advance before they've done the work, hey, don't forget, here's a list of features and benefits. And that's what you want to get in their hands. So the last couple of weeks, I had 2 appraisals on the same listing. I'm not sure why. It just went down that way. One appraiser called me and said, I want to go see this house. And I'm like, okay, great. When do you want to see it? Here's what I do. I want to make sure that that appraiser doesn't slip in there without me knowing. I don't want to ever find out, oh, yesterday the appraiser went out there. I want to have a chance as the listing agent to meet them, find out who it is, and slip them that $100. No, not that. Just kidding. And give them the list of features and benefits and maybe even the best comps I can come up with, and really fight and stand up for what my seller's property has. Here's why. Gosh, when was it? It was in the early teens, 2000-something teens. And my buyer was buying new construction. And the appraiser went out there. And this was before the appraisal system that we have today. So it was a little different, had a little more flexibility. He went out there, and this new construction house was like 3,000 square feet with a basement and a potential walk-up attic. The stairs were already finished, but when you got to the top of them, it was one of those weatherproofed kind of solid steel doors. So it's really insulation, well insulated. And so when you went in there, they had already put in extra heavy duty floor joists, and it wasn't just your regular little attic where you could just throw up a Christmas tree. You could actually walk in there. They had the subfloor down. They had studded walls because it was going to be a bedroom and a loft and a bathroom. They had all of that ready to go. All they had to do was put in the plumbing fixtures, the flooring, and the sheetrock. They even had the duct work for the heating and air system run, ready to turn it into finished. That's what he was going to do as soon as he closed on it. He just he was going to close on the property, and at the same time he closed on the property, he was going to get a home equity line of credit and borrow against that to finish that upper level. So it was almost immediately going to become finished living area. But right now it just looked like a nice walk-in attic space. And so the appraiser didn't give any extra credit for the attic that it really was. He just thought it was just your plain old attic, even though it had finished stairs that you could walk up to this door. So anyway, he came in at $11,000 lower than the contract price. $11,000 lower on the appraisal. That was a problem. Sometimes the buyer's actually happy about that because they might have a chance of the seller coming down on the price. But in this case, my buyer wanted to get that home equity line of credit and he needed it to come in at the number on the contract. And so he was upset. So I was able to call the appraiser back then. You can't do that anymore. And so I called him and I said, I'm just curious. I looked at it when we made the offer and we were talking about building this house with my client, just curious. I see on the appraisal that I've been given that you used a comparable sale from a nearby neighborhood. And it looks like there were two of the same floor plan over there. One sold $10,000 more than the other, and you used the smaller one. Why did you use the less expensive of the two? Just curious. And I was very careful, very polite, very careful. He's like, oh, I just did. On paper, they were identical because that's what the appraiser and we are limited by is what we can see on the printed screen or printout itself. Here's all, we can't go into those sold properties and really truly see them in person and compare. We just have to go off of the pictures provided and the description. And so based on the paperwork, all I could see was two identical houses that one sold for more than the other by $10,000. And I was just curious why he picked the smaller one. Because maybe he picked it because of where the lot was or something. And he just gave a very flimsy answer. And I said, well, okay, just curious, would you be okay with swapping it for the bigger one? Reworking the numbers and trying it for the bigger one, because this is a pretty nice house. And he said, no, but since you were nice about it, I will factor it in. I'll add it in as a fourth comparable, by the way. Most appraisals have 3 comps, maybe 4, but at least they have to have at least 3 sold comparables to go on. So that was nice of him. And the other issue was this. I noticed in his appraisal report, all he said was, he didn't really say anything about the walk-up space. And I said, I'm just curious, did you realize that attic is not just an attic? It's got like a floor. It's going to be finished into finished space, like 500 more square feet. It's got the plumbing. It's got the HVAC. And he said, no, I didn't realize any of that. That was when I realized and started making it a part of my list of what I do to get out there in front of that appraiser in the beginning and call their attention to things like this. Don't let them overlook it because it's much easier to get them to appreciate the value and give credit for those things before they do all the work. So he did. He said, well, I'll add in the higher number, the other comparable that was at the higher. I won't replace it, but I'll bring it in and then I will give more credit for this expandable attic that you're telling me about. And he came in at the value we needed. And I was lucky that I had that chance to tell him about this, but ever since that time, like in 2012 or 13, I now go out there every time, if at all possible. Or if they might, what I do now is I change the showing instructions so they can't go see it unless they make the appointment through me. That way I don't miss them. I know for sure when they're going out there because they can't get out there without getting my approval. And I clear all this with the seller, of course, and I'd let the seller know when the appraisal is going to be. But I want to have that chance to get in front of them and say, hey, look, here's this list of things that you might not be aware of. Could I also add it to the MLS sheet as an attachment or in the remarks? Sure. But is that appraiser maybe extra busy today and maybe skimming things? Maybe he's not that good anyway and overlook something? Yeah, maybe. So let's not risk it. Let me put it right in front of his face and read it to him if I have to. So that's what my goal is. And when you take one of those designations that gives you all that alphabet behind your name, once you get your license, like the GRI and the CRS and all that, one of them is called PSA, Pricing Strategy Advisor, and it's provided by the NAR, a lot of acronyms. It's provided by the Realtor Association. You pay for it, but you sit through some classwork. Now you can put PSA behind your name. Nobody knows what it means. You have to explain to the people what this thing means. But even in that course provided by the Realtor Association, it says go meet the appraiser on site. But again, the commission says don't you influence them or threaten them or bribe them, but yes, you are allowed to go talk to them. And so last week, one of them called me and he said, I think the siding is in pretty bad shape and it feels like it needs to be entirely replaced. I'm kind of surprised at how bad a shape it's in. And so I had to very politely and carefully say, well, where does that line stop and start? At what point are you acknowledging that it has a certain level of condition versus giving an opinion that maybe a contractor needs to have to say whether it needs to be completely replaced or not? In my opinion, not as a contractor or an appraiser, I've seen plenty of houses that had that same level of damage get repaired for not the cost of replacing it. Yeah, that's going to be the preference, but we're talking about making it basically waterproof. Can we keep the water out? Replace a couple of rotted boards. Yeah, for less than the cost of fully replacing it with vinyl instead of the wood masonite siding that it is. So he just came across sort of as maybe a newer. He wasn't sure what to do. And next thing I know, the very next day, another appraiser altogether called me to go out there. And I'm like, what's happening? I didn't tell him about the other guy because I didn't know what was going on. All he asked me was, can I get out there to see it? And I said, sure. When do you want to go? I liked him better. And I think what happened was the lender didn't like the first appraiser's work. And I actually heard from the buyer agent sound like he might not have even ever gone out there. He just got the work, accepted it, did some research, and didn't proceed it. I think he did go out there because he saw it and saw the siding for what it was, but somehow or other they didn't like, or he wasn't enough. And so a second appraisal was done. And that one worked. So you never know, right? Different appraisers are of different quality. You don't have much say-so over it. All we have control over is making sure they give credit where credit is due. And I didn't have much of a list because this is a typical fixer-upper 31-year-old house, and it shows. And so I told them all I could, which is brand new water heater in May. And it's bigger lot, bigger square footage than you're going to get in new construction and blah, blah, blah. I did the best I could for it. But that's part of our job, is to try to fight for our listing's value and make sure that appraisal comes in as much as it can come in legally. Wow. Interesting. Corey had a good little story there in the chat. So it's just a potential obstacle in the transaction. And so if I had let it happen and not bothered to even try to talk to them or meet them or change the instructions so that they had to reach me, then I'd have never known about any of this. And it could have been that they stopped at the first one and somehow didn't allow the loan to go through. Thankfully, it was a conventional loan, not an FHA or VA. I don't know that an FHA appraiser would have passed it. That's the kind of appraiser that does have to do a little bit of inspection. But typically a conventional loan, that was my first question with the first guy. When he was questioning the siding, I said, I'm just curious, is this an FHA loan or a conventional? Well, it's conventional, but I still feel like it's my responsibility to let them know the condition. I'm like, okay, you feel like, or you're required to? It's like, I wasn't getting very good answers. So that's part of it. Appraisers do appraisals. We as brokers do market analysis or a broker price opinion. And my little graphics fell apart. Both of those things, the CMA and the broker's price opinion, we're doing, in fact, all three of them are using the same kind of method. They are typically all the sales comparison method. When it's a house, single family or duplex, triplex, fourplex, something like that, 4 or less, we're using this sales comparison method. And so they're all using the same idea of picking similar properties and comparing them to the subject, making adjustments for the differences. But the main thing is this: a broker can never refer to that thing that we do, the CMA or the BPO. We can't call it an appraisal. We're looking for what a buyer's willing to pay and a seller's willing to accept in an open and competitive market. Arm's length transaction. Appraisers give a market value. We as brokers give a probable sales price. And here's an extra little element to it. The appraiser gives a market value as an exact number. She will say, this property is worth $512,000. And it is my opinion. At the top of the appraisal report, it says, this is the opinion. The word opinion is on it. Two different appraisers have two different opinions. Why? What could be the difference between you and another appraiser? Both of you are appraisers. One appraiser versus the other. What could be the difference in why they come up with a different value? What sorts of things could vary? That's a good one. What they see as valuable, the comps that they pick, how those comps are different from the subject, and what numbers they give for the differences. Because we'll learn about that here in a little bit. You pick the closest comps you can find, but then you still don't know two houses are exactly alike. One might be 100 feet bigger than the subject, so you need to adjust for that 100 square feet larger. You need to subtract from what that comp sold for. And it might be that one has a fireplace and one does not. How much is a fireplace worth? You got to subtract for the fireplace or add for it. Is it worth $2,500? Is it worth $5,000? Is it worth $10,000? Is there one number that serves all houses? No. What about Lake Norman, $3 million listing on the water? That fireplace costs more than the one in the $300,000 house, right? For sure. So I think I was talking to an appraiser one day and she was laughing because a newer agent had asked her a question. And she said, could I see your binder? The appraiser said, my binder? What do you mean? You know, your binder, the one where you keep all the adjustment figures in it. You know how much a fireplace is worth, or 100 square feet, or brick versus vinyl siding. There is no such thing. There's no one universal textbook that has all these adjustment values in it. You have to learn that on the job and just knowing the market. Back when the appraisal industry changed, as a result of 2008, they changed how we do appraisals in this market. Used to be the lender could pick the appraiser. The lender could pick, hey, I like how they did their work. They were really quick. They came in on value. We got no problems. Let's use them again. But maybe that appraiser really just couldn't justify the contract price on one time. And that lender might have reached out to them and said, if you want to stay on our list of appraisers that we use, let's rework these numbers and make this happen. We really want this loan to go through. That sounds like loan fraud to me. And so we realized, we need to add an element of separation between the lender and the appraiser. And so now the lender has to hire and order the appraisal through a third-party company. They can't pick the appraiser. They have to place the order, and that third-party company fulfills the order and puts it out there to an appraiser and says, hey, do you want this one? And if that appraiser doesn't, takes a pass, like maybe an Uber driver or maybe like a DoorDash, do you want to do this one or no? You don't? Okay, go to the next. The next appraiser says, yes, I'll take that order, and they go do the work. But they can't be in touch with the lender because it led to that sort of fraudulent behavior. The lender shouldn't be able to reward the appraiser with future work because they came in at the sale price. The appraiser should come in on the sale price based on the comparables and the adjustments that they arrive to. So now it's much harder to have a dispute once the appraisal comes in low later. So anyway, that appraiser's coming in with an exact number. We as brokers, when are we doing our CMA? We're doing a market analysis, a competitive market analysis, or comparable or comparative. You might see different words for it. We're doing that to win a listing. We're doing that on a listing appointment to show that seller not only what are we going to do to sell it, but how much do we think it will sell for in the form of a probable sales price. And wouldn't it be smart to not give them an exact number? We should give that probable sales price in a range. If you tell them $315 because you are under the impression that they're actually going to do the things you suggest and put all that junk in boxes in the garage instead of leaving it out in the house, including the collectible figurines lining the entire living room and the cat box right beside the front door and all the staging things and cleaning things and things you suggest, and they don't do any of it, but they told you they would. Well, now that they haven't done it, is it going to take longer to sell? And might it sell for less than what you told them it would? Because originally you told them it would sell for this amount because you thought they were going to do the work? Sure. So here's the way you do it. Based on my research, I'm seeing similar houses to yours after making adjustments that I'll go over with you in a moment, should sell anywhere from $310 to $320. What's the difference? Well, the $320 is going to be if you do the things on my list. If you declutter, if you clean, if you paint. Sometimes it needs way more than that. If you get rid of the chalk outline in the front yard, if you do all the things that might make it less desirable, then you might be more likely to get toward the top of the range of value, or I used the V word, the top of the range of probable sales price. But if you decide all that stuff's too much work and you just want to throw it on the market and see what happens, then I would expect more on the lower end. Get that off your shoulders. Blame it on them, right? Because they love to blame us. That's why the range is important. It impresses upon them the importance of their role in this, which is getting it ready, taking your advice. If they don't take your advice, they shouldn't expect $320. They should expect $310. I gave one not long ago, and I said, I think it's probably going to sell for probable sale price, probably between $320 and maybe $330. Just depends on how much competition we have, but it also depends on how much you do. They needed to get rid of some furniture. They needed to do a little cleaning, and they did. It was a family friend, so I actually helped them move some of that furniture and get some things out, because if I didn't help them, we wouldn't go on the market as soon. So sometimes you do what you got to do to get that thing on the market. And guess what? It originally came in at $330, but then enough work was deemed needed that it came down to $322. Okay, I'll take that. That was a pretty good estimate of probable sales price, right? And all that was based on comparables and just my knowledge of the market. And a range is useful. Here's how this sales comparison method works. We have that subject property that we're trying to figure the value of. Do we know how much that subject's going to sell for? In the beginning, we have no idea. The only way we figure it out is by looking and doing the research and looking up those comparable sales. And an appraiser picks at least 3, so we need to emulate that. In fact, I'll look at more. I will try to find the 3 best ones, but if it's a hot selling neighborhood and there's 10 recent solds, I'm going to look at every one of them and maybe weed them out based on how similar, and maybe find the 3 or 4 closest ones to the subject, because the fewest adjustments you can make, the better. The fewer adjustments, the more it already is like the subject, the better of an estimate of sale price it will be. So that's what you're doing. You're taking that first comparable property and realizing, oh, it's got a fireplace. The subject does not. We know that comparable sold for $150,000, but it has a fireplace. The subject property that I'm trying to list does not have one. What do we need to do? If the if the comparable property does not have a fireplace, like our subject does not have a fireplace, then would it have sold for $150,000? We need to take money away from what it sold for to account for that fireplace that it has extra. And we'll make adjustments like that for all those differences: square footage, condition, fireplace, siding, basement versus no basement, garage, 2-car versus 3-car versus no car. And we just work our way through and make adjustments to each of those comps. And come around to that range of value. So appraisers do that, and they produce it in the form of this is kind of what it looks like, the official form, a uniform residential appraisal report, and there it is in red. This is an opinion of this person's value. This person's opinion of the market value. So the purpose of this appraisal is to give an estimate or an opinion of value called a market value. It's not a science. It's more of an art form because it is very dependent on who's doing it and what they choose to select for comps and how much they give as adjustments. Two different appraisers are going to say that fireplace is worth two different amounts. There's no one fireplace dollar amount. And even more importantly, the dollars per square foot between these two houses that are 400 square feet different. One appraiser might use 100, 101. The other appraiser might use 78. Where did they come from? Where did that come from for them? Appraisals are done by licensed appraisers. There is an expiration date. What do you think the expiration date of an appraisal is? How long is it good for? Good guesses. I see that a lot. 30 days, 1 year. Some people say through the closing date. Think about it this way. What does this appraisal have in it? It's got the 3 best comparables that appraiser could find in the moment. But maybe all 3 of those comparables were still not that much like the subject. What if tomorrow the best possible comparable closes? Tomorrow is the day after this appraisal's done, finished, turned in. And tomorrow, the house across the street that's the exact same floor plan, everything is very similar, that one closes. Well, you didn't have the luxury of including that in the appraisal. That appraiser couldn't use it. It wasn't yet closed yesterday or today. This one, even a better comp closes the day after the report is published. So therefore, the appraisal is really only good for the day it's printed, the day it's finished, because even just tomorrow, it could be outdated and a whole better comp or 2 or 3 could be closed and therefore usable. That does not mean they have to redo the appraisal. Why do I keep mixing them up? I don't know. They don't have to redo it. It's still the only one involved, but the testable answer there is it's good for the day that it is done. And that's about it. Meaning it's not necessarily going to be the most accurate because even a better comp could close tomorrow. Yeah, probably you might see that or the same day it's printed or something along those lines. There's not like a hard and fast definitive number of hours or days. The point here is it's good for the day that it's completed because it could have been even better tomorrow, but it won't be revised. You got to work with what you got. Tomorrow, a better comp could have come about. So the expiration date is the day it's printed, really. They still use it. but that's the expiration date. Minimum standards of practice. The appraisal board requires these people to do this to a certain level of proficiency, just like the real estate commission requires us to do this stuff with reasonable skill and care. So ultimately, if you just think an appraiser is way off and is not handling business properly, you could turn them in. You could call the appraisal board and say, I think they're doing something wrong. One thing that some appraisers have clearly done wrong even today is sometimes appraising things differently because of who owns the house. There have been cases of fair housing violations with appraisals. Oh, they see pictures hanging on the wall. They think it's a couple who is a different class, protected class, and therefore maybe this is a neighborhood with mostly that class of people, that fair housing protected class, therefore this isn't worth as much as it would be otherwise. That's sadly a thing that is still happening. So that's the sort of thing where you would be suspicious of such a thing and call the appraisal board to complain. Who can do what? CMA is done as part of our listing appointment, our work to determine what it probably will sell for, and therefore we do it for free. We're not charging them a dollar amount for the CMA because we're trying to get the listing by providing this CMA and telling what our marketing strategy will be. However, so that's for potential clients, right? Someone that we have a fiduciary relationship with. The BPO is a little bit different. It's the same calculations. It's the same selection of comps and consideration of adjustments, but you're doing a broker price opinion for money, a one-off. You want to know my opinion of what you'll sell for? Then I'll do a BPO for you and you have to pay me for it. And that's for customers, not clients, right? Clients are who you are going to list the property of. A customer is someone, another word you might see is third party. So you would do a BPO for a third party. There's a non-fiduciary relationship there. All they want from you is your opinion of what it'll sell for. Tell me some examples of what third party might be interested in paying you. It's not going to be much, maybe $75 or $100. They'll pay you for a BPO. Who might pay you for your opinion of probable sales price in the form of this BPO? That's a good one. Yeah, Corey says a for sale by owner. They don't want to list it. They don't want you to list the property for them, but they do appreciate that you maybe show up in the neighborhood. They've seen your sign. They feel like you probably know value. And maybe if they're willing to pay you $100, you would do a BPO for them. It's a good one. What one do you think happened around that 2008 period? It still happens today, but there are agents back then that really were killing it because we had a lot of foreclosures. There it is. Banks can pay brokers for doing a BPO. A bank could say to you, tell me how much this house should probably sell for. Now, here's the thing. A bank can pay you for that BPO if they're maybe trying to decide if they want to foreclose on the property. But they cannot use your BPO if they want to make a loan. Originating a loan, not allowed to use a BPO. What do you think the bank needs to do or get when it's for the purpose of originating a loan or a refinance or a second mortgage? They're not allowed to get our opinion. They need to get the appraiser's opinion. And that's a difference of $400 or $500. They would rather use us, maybe, if they trust us, in our opinion, but they could pay us $100. They have to pay the appraiser $500 or $600, and that's what they have to do if it's originating a mortgage. So that's a testable item to stay aware of. So you could get in with a bank and they like how you did the work and they keep calling you. You keep doing BPOs for $100. Who's interested here in doing a BPO for a bank for $100? Who's on board? Raise your hand. You good with it, or do you have questions? I see sort of, I don't know, you tell me more. You should ask questions. Here's the question. How long is it going to take you to do it? if it takes you an hour, I'll work it for $100 an hour. Yeah, I'm down with that. But what if it takes you 8 hours or 10 hours? Are you good with $10 an hour? No, emphatically no. Here's the thing. When it's a bank, they usually make you use a very specific form. It does take a while to go down through, and you have to plug in these. It's not like you just write it on the back of a napkin and say, yeah, I've done the calculations and I figure it's worth this. No, you've got to use their required form and like an online fill in the blank kind of a deal. Do it in a format that looks a lot like an appraisal report, really. And it takes a while, and you got to go there, take a certain number of pictures and access it. And it could really take 3 or 4 or 5 hours. But you might still want to do it, because sometimes in this business, a lot of times in this business, things are the long game. And so if you do one, the first one, it's going to take you a while. Then you start getting the hang of it and you do more and it takes less time. But if you're the bank's go-to, that particular bank always calls you for their BPOs, and then they finally get an REO property, they have to take one back and they own real estate, you might now be on their short list of agents that they will let list it. And now you're in. They don't just randomly list with a bunch of different agents. They like to use ones that have done work for them before. If you can be their go-to agent, that caused a lot of agents through the 2008 period to make a bunch of money, because they pretty much owned that bank's business. That bank just kept feeding the business to them. And those agents who got in that little niche had to hire teams to work these listings, and they were pretty straightforward. It's like nobody's in there. It's a foreclosure. It might need to be cleaned and repaired, so that maybe that bank entrusts that agent to see through that process and meet contractors out there. But it's a steady stream of business, all because they did 20 or 30 BPOs for $70 a piece once upon a time and earned their way into it. So that's the reason you might go that route. So the main thing for the test purposes, BPOs are for customers, non-fiduciary. CMAs are for clients or potential clients in order to get a listing. Here's the bad news. As a provisional broker, you cannot do a CMA or a BPO for money. You can do a CMA in order to get a listing, but out there in the wild, they might call a CMA, they might call the thing you do for money a CMA, either or. But the main thing you might see on the test is, can a provisional broker do a market analysis for money? No. You've got to become a full broker in order to do that. Get those post classes out of the way so that you're able to do this, if it's something you want to do. Here's when we cannot do BPOs for money. Even the full brokers who are allowed to do them say no to the BPO if it's for one of these below: originating a mortgage, refinancing a mortgage, or anytime an appraisal is required by law. When might that happen? Maybe a judge says we need to figure out what the value of this property is worth for this dispute, so therefore get an appraisal, not a BPO. Some sort of law-related thing that says it must be an appraisal instead of a BPO, then that's what has to happen. We need to talk about elements of value, and these things affect value in these ways. Desirability affects value. In what way? Obviously, the more people who want it, the higher it's worth, the more it's worth, right? Both desire and financial ability. I have the desire for lots of price ranges of houses, but I lack the financial ability for some of them, right? So it's both those things. Desire, financial ability affects the value through desirability. How a buyer can use it makes it worth more to them than another buyer. One buyer wants to buy it because it's in a neighborhood that allows you to have a home-based business. Another buyer just likes it because it's pretty. The one who wants to use it for the home-based business might not have very many other choices. There's not a lot of neighborhoods that allow home-based businesses, perhaps. So they probably would be willing to pay more because it accomplishes a goal more than just it's pretty. The one who just likes how it looks could get their needs accomplished in any neighborhood because they don't want to do a home-based business, for instance. So how can they use it? Utility affects value. Scarcity, we're seeing that all over the place now because we have a lot of scarcity. Very limited supply affects value. Values go up when there's fewer buyers or more buyers, but low inventory. And we're living it. Goes back to that old classic saying, 3 most important words in real estate: location, location, location. And then transferability affects value in this way. How easy is it to sell the property, convey it, transfer it from one owner to another? Maybe there's a cloud on the title, and so that's causing some problems, and it's not every buyer that's willing to wait for that cloud to be cleared up. And maybe it's got liens on it. Now you've reduced your buyer pool quite a lot. Some buyers don't want to buy property with liens. Some buyers do because they know they'll get to pay less for it. But some buyers might say, well, I just need to get in there and start living. So how easy is it to sell it? How clear is the title? What's the condition like? Some people say, I watch a lot of HGTV, and so I want a fixer-upper. And my first question is this: what is a fixer-upper to you? Oh, coat of paint, new carpet. That is not a fixer-upper to a lot of people. So that's an important thing to get figured out up front. You could send them stuff that literally has no floor. That's a fixer-upper. No, I need a floor. Okay, well, let's get some parameters on this thing. Right? So it's going to be, I'll buy it. Has no floor. I'll put the floor in it, but I might be limited as to my financing. I might be limited as to my need to live in it as soon as I close on it. I don't have a place to live until I add the floor and get the raccoon out of there. I literally saw one on like 7 acres, and sometimes I'm looking for ourselves to either rent. Sometimes I'm looking, maybe I could find a killer deal to just buy for cash. And it was an older house that was exactly that. Part of the roof is missing. Part of the floor is missing. I happen to have a wife I want to keep, and she would not be happy in a tent in the backyard while I'm fixing the roof or the floor. Or I'd maybe have to put a mobile home on it if the zoning allowed that for like 9 months while I fixed it, all of which would jeopardize the marital situation. So you got to know your situation, your audience. Condition can affect transferability. Things in the worst shape might take longer to sell, even in a market like this. Properties have all of these qualities in some measure to have value. There are some forces affecting property values: social forces, economic, political, and physical. How does that work? Social forces might just be like you want to be in a place that has like an association, homeowners association with groups, maybe like pickleball tournaments and courts. That's a thing. There are places being built that are dedicating their previously tennis court space to pickleball because that's such a popular thing now. Maybe the whole boating lifestyle, the swim and tennis lifestyle. Economic forces, what's the tax rate? And in Charlotte, we see this a lot because people might work in Charlotte, but they don't want to pay Charlotte taxes. So they go out to the suburbs in other surrounding counties, maybe in Mount Holly or Belmont over in Gastonia, or Concord and Harrisburg and Cabarrus, or Indian Land and Indian Trail and Mint Hill over in Union County, because lower taxes, maybe more stable school systems that don't get bussed around from one year to the next. So Charlotte is the draw because of the job, but as long as it's a 20 or 30-minute commute, they're cool because they're going to get more house for their money because less of their payment needs to go toward taxes. So that affects value. The values might be worth a little more because of that. Political might be an example of zoning because there's a zoning board that can approve or not approve property uses. And then physical might be it's close to the light rail system, or it's close to 485 interchange, or whatever the belt around Raleigh is called. Things like that. 4 forces affecting values. Let's look at some principles of value. How about this situation? We've got a neighborhood on the left. Probably used to look like the thing on the right. The farm is still there, but there's a neighborhood right up next to it. Which one is being used to its highest and best use? The one with the development or the one with the farm? Or C, it depends. If it's in Colorado or California, maybe that farm is for a very particular type of crop that is worth more than just soybeans. So maybe that is the highest and best use. But maybe that farmer is getting too old to do the farming anymore and wants to leave it to the kids. And the kids are like, we don't want to ride tractors and cultivate things. We're going to sell out to this developer and let them add a phase 10 and our farmland turns into that. So the biggest principle, the biggest, most important question the appraiser is asking when they do their appraisal is the property being used to its highest and best use? Is this the most valuable use it could be used for? Not that it should be. It's not a judgment. It's just a acknowledgement. Like my property I'm at now. Is this the highest and best use? I'm zoned industrial. I live in it residentially. So no. But the person I'm selling it to is going to be using it industrially. And so, yeah, they'll be using it to its highest and best once they knock this house down and build that big building they want to run their business out of. What about this one? The principle of substitution. The idea here is 2 houses pretty much identical. One of them is asking $215, the other one's asking $220. Which one sells first? The lower for the money, right? You're asking less for the same thing, you can get the same thing for pretty much less. Principle of substitution says that one's going to sell faster. Supply and demand, we're seeing it right now. Low supply, big demand. We might also see the opposite someday. Like this. Lots of houses for sale, not a lot of buyers to buy them. What's going to happen then? Multiple offers? No. The seller's going to be thankful for every offer they get. It might take 4 or 5 months to even get one. I remember when days on the market, that statistic was more like 120, 4 months typical to get a contract. I sold one in a day not long ago. We're not in a buyer's market. We're in a seller's market, but that's coming. The buyer's market will be here again someday. The principle of conformity is big in real estate. It says things have more value if they match. So a neighborhood full of houses on the right that all look like that, then you have one oddball house on the left like that, a geodesic dome. Not every buyer wants to live in the unicorn house, right? And so they might have to sell it for less. They probably will. So that's the principle of conformity. I got one of those. There's one in Cabarrus County. She saw something I ran and she called me, and she'd had an agent that tried, and I tried, and we tried to price it per square foot, and she wanted $300,000 at the time, 20 years ago, and we just couldn't get it sold. Because everybody wanted your traditional type of house. She was going to have to, and she wasn't willing to come down, so I had to let it go. She would have had to take a discounted price because a smaller pool of buyers are interested in buying something that doesn't conform. Yeah, no surprise. Carolina Beach has one just like it. They're great for efficiency, heat efficiency usually. And her husband had done all this research and he had built it. So it's kind of sad. It didn't have a garage. That was another strike against us. But just the shape was really causing the problem. We'll come back from break. We'll talk about this principle a little bit more. I see back here in 10. And then 45 minutes, and we're done. Here we go. Let's talk about that principle of conformity some more. Maximum value is realized when the use conforms to existing standards. That's the classic definition. Similar to design and style, HOA covenants and restrictions. And what you want to really be careful about is overbuilding. That's another big one that we talk about on that listing appointment. You've done a great job here. Your house is lovely, but it's the biggest one in the neighborhood. And so that's going to probably be a problem. When you build the biggest thing in the neighborhood, it's probably not going to be worth as much as they want it to be. You would not calculate the typical price per square foot of the other houses in there and then just apply it to something that's 1,000 feet bigger than everything else in there. It's not the best way to have good appreciation. The best place to be is like the middle to upper middle of a neighborhood. So you have room to grow. But if you've already added on and it's much bigger than everything else, not great. Here's another example of conformity. If you're that house on the left trying to sell, and what's going on the right is your just typical everyday situation because of whatever reason they've got a bunch of cars always in the driveway or parked on the street, you might have trouble selling, right? You're not conforming with the use. That's why it's kind of nice sometimes to have an HOA when it says you can't have cars in the driveway or you can only have one, or it limits something like a car lot. And literally one is even in the front yard here. So that could be a problem. Yeah, and I've also seen that in neighborhoods that look good when it's Monday through Friday, 9 to 3. But when everybody gets home, you really appreciate how small the streets are because people are parking on the street and you can hardly even get through it. Did they put sidewalks on both sides but left the street at a width that just doesn't allow for a lot of safe parking on it, and there's no rule against it? So that's kind of that can be a limitation. Conformity might be this guy. If you're trying to sell the house across the street and every time you leave, that's what you see, fine if you like it. But when you try to sell it, how many buyers are going to be willing to live across the street from it? Maybe about as many as who live across the street from this one. I like this one. I kind of wish I had a necktie in that design or shoes. What about this one? You're across the street from this guy. Maybe, apparently, you're Bob and you've been asking him to paint his fence and he did, but not exactly how you expected that he would. And then ultimately it turns into something like this. Conformity can be a problem. Principle of anticipation. Something that's coming later could add to the value. If you look in the background, you can see maybe a worn down, your typical downtown area that's seen better years, but the new project is coming in. This might even make you think of this word called gentrification, right? They're putting in the Starbucks, putting in the new sexy, cool shapes and buildings and this and that, turning it into a whatever. So are investors going to come along? You know, it reminds me of an article I just saw today. That whole Maui fire thing, tragic Maui fire. There are already real estate investors and real estate agents swooping in to buy people's property. And somebody who posted it said, what are your thoughts on this? I know my thoughts on it. And I'm still thinking about it. I guess on the one hand, there are buzzards circling the kill, right? On the other hand, if somebody needs to get out of there and can have money today, but how much money is that going to be? Right. So I can certainly see lots of room, and I have no doubt there's lots of room for predatory behavior and probably taking advantage of a situation. That's probably sadly going to be the norm in a situation like that. So anticipation of what's to come can affect value. Now, this could go in the other direction too. This one is probably going to be worth more in the future, but You could have the case where, like, I'm not sure exactly, but it makes me think of in, I guess, Las Vegas, there was a strip and then the road, like there was a bypass, or maybe it's just a movie I'm thinking of, because of the way the bypass went through, that original section of town just didn't get any traffic anymore because traffic didn't need to go by there anymore. And so it just decreased. Anticipation, all the new sexy stuff is over there, not over here. And yeah, okay. I'm sure that's happened quite a few places. Here's another one. Once upon a time, my dad lived on 8 acres and worked off of his diesel mechanic work off of 8 acres on Rocky River Road in Charlotte, about a mile from where they ended up running 485 outer loop. And so his parents got sick, his dad died, his mom had Alzheimer's, and we just needed to sell the 8 acres so that we could afford to take care of her. He also had gotten sick, my dad did. And in our family, we just needed the money. The old rich dudes in the overalls, the old farmers with rolls of hundreds in their overalls, you'd never imagine that they were wealthy, that kind of farmer. They had said, you should keep it. In 5 more years, it's going to have this interchange coming through. It'll be worth so much more. But for our situation, it was kind of irrelevant. So anticipating something going through, a road going through, some sort of a major project going through, affects value. This is the fun one on the listing appointment, the principle of contribution. I'm so proud of my new pool. Surely it's worth more than the $20,000 that I spent on it. And you have to sometimes give them the bad news. A pool is a crapshoot, right? It may or may not. It might even be a liability for some buyers. It may or may not add the value that you spent. And quite often, I tell people the best way to buy a pool or own a pool is to buy a house that has one in it, as opposed to putting one in. Because many amenities don't add value at all. It's based on how it contributes to the entire property. Is it a pool or is it an outdoor kitchen? Should you spend the money on a extended roof with a nice fancy outdoor kitchen and grill area and fireplace? Or should you spend the money on finishing the basement? Those are all questions that a client might ask you. If it's somebody, a repeat client, hey, I'm thinking about doing this or that. Which thing will add more value later? The pool is probably the biggest question mark. On the one hand, if everything else in the neighborhood has one, you probably want one too, just to hold up and be competitive. On the other hand, if it's a certain climate, a certain place, you may not even want one, and the typical buyer won't, but you do. So a principle of contribution can work against you. Principle of competition is the idea that McDonald's is never lonely. Have you noticed? It doesn't take long. It's never a McDonald's by itself. There's always competitors nearby. You know they're not in the fast food business, don't you? They're in the real estate business and they sell fast food. So the more competition you have, profits attract competition. Too much competition affects value. Now people have tons of choices in this situation. Same for real estate. How many similar properties are on the market? That's something we look at when we do a market analysis for a client. Here's what things have sold for, the proven things that sold, so we can determine what it probably will sell for, but we also need to look at what your competition is too. So I'll show them the active listings on the market. I want them to see, well, I think you're worth $450, but look, there are 30 houses in the $430 to $460 price range. Not today, but in a normal or even a buyer's market. And so looking at the competition is important. It might be that the competition is split apart into certain price points. So they're thinking of pricing it at $450. And so how many houses are for sale between $430 and $450? Let's say 10 of them. How many houses for sale between $450 and $470? Maybe 5. Which one do you want to be competing with? Maybe you price it a little higher to compete with fewer, but can you really compare to them? Or are you smaller or inferior in some way, your property? So that principle of competition is something that affects value too. And the principle of change. On the left is Charlotte. downtown Charlotte 100 years ago. That's me on the bicycle right there. And on the right is Charlotte today. The point here is no condition remains constant. Things are constantly changing. The only constant is change. And so that change affects value, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. So again, out of all of these principles we just looked at, which one is going to be looked at the most by an appraiser when considering the value of the property? Which one's most important to an appraiser? What are they asking? Literally, they are going to say and acknowledge this in the appraisal report somewhere. Whether the property is being used at its what? You got it. Highest and best use. That's what the appraiser's kind of going to consider as part of their process. Speaking of their process, they're looking at specific data, costs and sales and income and expenses. It depends on the type of property. If it's a rental property, they're going to look at income and expenses because it's a business. If it's just a house to live in, owner occupied, they're going to look at costs and sales, similar properties that have sold, and how much the seller put into it, and does that translate to more value or no. General data, an appraiser is going to look at the market from a 30,000 foot view, a forest for the trees kind of view. The nation, the region, the city, the neighborhood, what are the markets doing in those expanded areas? The appraiser is also going to define the problem. What is the purpose of this appraisal? And what kind of method am I going to use to determine the value? What is the problem? What is the purpose? Is this an appraisal for a purchase? Or is it an appraisal for a refinance? That can be two different numbers. An appraisal for a refinance doesn't have to be quite as accurate, because the refinance means the lender just wants to refinance the loan. And so all they're worried about is the lender wants to make sure there's enough equity in the property and enough value there. That's not the same kind of an appraisal as if it's a purchase. So when a seller says to me, I just had it appraised last year for when we refinanced, I say, well, okay, but I still need to do my own homework to see what today's market and the probable sales price is going to be. That appraisal really is just useless, frankly. The determination and performance of the appropriate scope of work, what needs to be done? If it's an investment property, they need to look at the financial statements. What sorts of profit and loss and income and what kinds of operating costs are there? If it's a house that you're going to live in, they're going to look at just the comparable sales. If it's a unique property, like a school, an old school or a church or a government building, those don't sell every day. There's no neighborhood full of old school buildings. You can't use the comparative sales approach and look up comparable properties. There, you just can't find 3 comparable schools. So you've got to use the cost approach. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Collecting and analyzing the data, whatever that data needs to be, depending on the method. And then determining that highest and best use, looking at competing properties, looking at current uses and potential uses. And if it's a cost approach, it depends on the type of approach, but you might have to estimate that land value. And then estimating the value by each of these 3 approaches that we talked about. We're going to get into each of them individually. The appraiser is going to look at the cost approach. It looks like this. The appraiser will do the sales comparison method. Oops. Oh boy. Sales comparison method, also known as a CMA. And they're going to look at comps. So that's one of the ways the appraiser is going to look at it. What are similar properties selling for? They might also use the cost approach when we get into the cost approach study, what that is determining how much it would cost new, realizing that it's not new, and so subtracting out for that fact called depreciation. And then they're also going to, if it's an income property, they'll look at use the income approach by looking at the money, the income versus the outgo. Now, what kind of property is it? If it's a single family house, they're going to give more weight to the number they got using that sales comparison method. In other words, let's say they got $500,000 of an estimate of value by using the sales comparison approach. Let's say they came up with $550 when they used the cost approach by figuring out what it would cost to build new today and then taking out for appreciation. And then let's say using the income approach, because it is a rental property, they got the $525 estimate of value. Which one are they going to lean more toward? The appraiser is not going to average these three numbers. They're going to say it's a single family home being used by the owner, so therefore we're going to lean more toward the value being $500. Or if that's not the case, it's more of a income property, then they're going to lean more toward the number they came up with by using the evaluation of it as an income property. Or if what it is more like an old building, an old school or church, then the cost approach might be the best method. What you'll notice, though, out of all three of these estimates, the cost approach tends to be the most expensive result in value. And it's because you're starting with how much it would cost to build new. And then it's up to that appraiser's opinion as to how much you can depreciate because it's 40 years old. Right. The heating system, flooring, walls, the style, the floor plan, all that stuff applies. So we'll get more into those approaches. And so they're estimating the value by each of the approaches, and then they are reconciling those values like we just saw. They never average them. Those three different approaches of valuation, they don't take the average. They put more weight toward the one that's most similar to the property, the subject property itself. Then they submit the final value estimate in a formal written report, like we saw a little bit ago that said the word opinion at the top of it. And they sign it and certify it, and that's the thing that gets turned in. So the first step in the process, one of the first things they do is define the problem. And then one of the last steps they do is the reconciliation, as we'll see later. Here are those methods. Sales comparison is for single family properties and land. If you need to figure out the value of dirt, you're going to use the sales comparison method. Look at other dirt, other acreage. Now, what you wouldn't do is look at acreage that's way too big or way too small, because the bigger the acreage, the lower the dollars per acre. Typically, the smaller the acres, the higher the dollars per acre. So you're not going to compare a 10-acre subject property to a 100-acre comparable property. You're going to try to find something within maybe 8 to 12 or maybe 5 to 15 acres to compare to. You're going to try to start as close as you can in the size and work your way out to get more and more comparables that you might need. So that, as well as single family properties, that would also be duplexes, 2, 3s, and 4s, but those primarily, meaning like one side of a duplex or one side of a triplex. Cost approaches for special uses, public buildings, government, churches, schools, old buildings that are just not easy to find comparables for, so you have to use the cost approach that we'll learn about. And then income producing properties, use the income approach. An appraiser uses all three when possible. You will see at the bottom of the appraisal, like page 2 or 3, if it's not an income property, they won't use it. But if it's anything other than an income property, they'll use both the sales and the cost approach, but probably lean toward the sales comparison method if it's a single family or land sale. And it's not as common to run into churches, schools, and public buildings. You'd probably be a commercial agent, a specialist in that field. What an appraiser must not do is take an average of those three approaches or use the mean or median value. What they should do is put more weight on the one that fits the property the best, depending on the type. Let's talk about picking comps. We talked about that a little bit already. What are some ways, some features we need to look at when choosing comparable properties? What sorts of things would you look for in determining what comparable properties to use? Appraiser's looking for at least 3 or 4. The lender will require at least 3 or 4. That's good. Square footage, location, those are big. The closer in size, the better. So the fewest adjustments you can make, the more accurate the estimate will be. Location, design, size, physical characteristics, same style, and of course, geographic location and recent sales. Right, good one. And then here's another one in the middle. It needs to have been sold in a typical open market condition, meaning if this is a property that's just somebody wants to sell because they're ready to move, and you find something that sold last week that was a foreclosure, should you use that foreclosure? Comparable. It's not going to be a good match because what is it about distressed sales? They probably took less. Whether it's a foreclosure, short sale, anything that involves maybe an estate sale, those sorts of things are probably going to be not your typical sale price. Yeah, wholesaling. Where do we find comps? What's the best place to find comparables, you think? Best place to get a list of things that have sold. Yeah, the best by far is the MLS. And that's why some of you who may not even be all that interested in selling real estate for other people might still want to get your license so that you have access to the best source of comps because it's going to be the most detailed. MLS has tons of detail, much more than the tax records, although the tax records are another source. It's just that the details are quite a bit less. The best source for comps, MLS. If you can't find them in the MLS, look in the tax record, maybe the Register of Deeds, but that's going to be painful, agonizing, and it's going to take a while. The problem with tax records, for one thing, they don't have as many details and they're quite likely incorrect. And usually as a property owner, you're glad that the tax record is incorrect because it's incorrect showing a smaller square footage than you really have. And you're paying taxes based in part on how many square feet you've got, and you kind of don't mind that the city thinks you have 1,800 and you really have 23. Did you get a permit to add those extra 500 feet? Maybe, maybe not. Hopefully you did because you really need that when you sell. But that would be one way they would find out that you're a bigger size. But quite often when I'm on a listing appointment, I'll show them their tax record and I'll say, there's probably an error here. We'll just see in a moment if you find it. Because I don't trust the square feet, which is also the reason that the automated estimators, those websites like the Zillow's Estimate, the Realtor, any other, not just picking on Zillow, but any website that offers a press the button and will tell you what your house is worth. Where do they get their information? Well, I know where they don't get it. They don't get it from a human that went out there and visited. They got it from tax records. Maybe they got it from MLS to some degree, but they can't make adjustments. They can't really, that algorithm can't see this house compared to that house. And that's where the problem comes in. There was, I think it was the Zillow CEO whose estimate was like 40% wrong, or maybe $70,000 off from what it actually sold for. It was some big number, a significant number. And they admit it in the fine print that we're not promising a value up to a certain percentage. It could be this much of an error percentage because it's not a human involved. There's nobody who actually goes out. What if your house is the same floor plan as the one down the street, same exact floor plan, but you put all the extras in yours? They don't have anything. All they wanted was space under roof. There's a neighborhood called CP Morgan from years ago, and they would do that. They would let you have the same 3,000 foot house, but if you wanted to deck it all out and put the really nice kitchen and bath and everything, you could do that for more money, of course, but you could also just have that same amount of space with a very minimal basic level of all those other things. And so if both those houses showed up on a website trying to determine the value, and one of them went for $300,000 and the other went for $350,000, but everything else in the data showed the exact same house, how do they reconcile that? Which one do they pick to compare to yours? Maybe they pick the smaller one, and maybe you're more like the bigger one because you're another one who went all out on your kitchen and bathroom upgrade possibilities. So that's how those things can be a problem. The best comps are recent comps. The best comps are geographically close, similar type. That's a big one. If at all possible, pick a similar type, 2-story versus 1-story. One reason for that is that 1-story house has a roof on it, and so does that 2-story house. And this 1-story house is 2,000 square feet, but so is this 2-story house. It's just that they're stacked up, and so the roof can be smaller, so it costs less to roof it. Also, that 2,000 square foot ranch compared to that 2,000 square foot 2-story has to be on a bigger lot, and it's got a bigger footprint. So the extra lot cost is going to be more. Other things are going to be more. Now, I talked to an appraiser just last week, and I asked him this question: would you weed that out if you needed to use a 2-story comp? It was the only one available. And he said, yeah, I would. I would just make a note about it. I would make an adjustment. But for our purposes for this class, that's not ideal. And we're just going to say for this class, you don't do it. So don't compare 2-story with 1-story if at all possible. Similar size, again, the fewer changes in adjustments, the better. So pick something that's between 1,800 and 2,000 feet if the subject is 1,900 feet. If you find a great comp that's 1,500 square feet, you're going to have to make a 400 square foot adjustment. Difference between your subject size and that comp size. So try to keep it close, but sometimes you just can't help it. And then similar updates, similar amenities, but you're limited here on what you can see on that page. You don't get to go visit those comps. They're closed. They're sold. Those owners are living their lives. They don't want you coming in to their house. So you got to go by the pictures. Thankfully, there's allowable in our MLS, at least like 45 of them. Not that they all have 40-some pictures, but you're limited by that, by the data in the MLS and the pictures provided. But you'll make adjustments based on appliances, hardwood floors, granite, things like that. Let me show you something. So if you're going through trying to do an adjustment, trying to do a market analysis, you might do something like this. You're going to do a search. I'm going to pick my go-to neighborhood because I know there's a lot of listings in there typically, called Highland Creek. I'm going to pick closed properties. I'm going to look at all of them eventually, but I'm going to start just by looking at the closed ones. And the default is 0 to 180 days. And I'll probably say, well, my subject property is, let's say 2,000, and let's say it's 2,200 square feet. So I'm going to look between 2,000 and 2,400, maybe a little 200 plus or minus window there. And then I'm also going to say, show me 2 stories only, because it's a 2-story. And look, so far that gives us 19 potential properties that have sold in the last 180 days between 2,000 and 2,400 feet. And in real life, I'd probably look at that. But let me go a little further. Let me add a garage. Oh, that didn't change anything. So let me add that it's a 2-car garage, and that dropped it down to 16 results instead of 19. We're getting there. Let me also say, just show me stuff with brick or partial brick. What'd that do to it? Oh, that brought me down to 10. Let's look at those 10. And so out of these 10, we see that it's a pretty good split. There's a 2,000 foot one that sold for $384. There's a 2,380 one that sold for $455. And that's pretty much the range that things have sold for. Next, I would notice, oh, how old are they? Oh, they're all in the same general age range, 92 to 99. And then I might notice the bedrooms, but square feet is a little more important than bedrooms in the wild, actually. But then I'm going to start looking down through them. And I'm going to say, okay, look, this one sold for $384 and they were asking $384. That's interesting. Let's see if they paid any closing costs for the buyer. And they did. It sold for $384, but they paid just about $15,000 for the buyer's closing costs. That really means they sold for $370, doesn't it? $384 minus 15, or I guess $369. So that's not the same as $384, is it? But it shows up as $384 on the closed price right here. So that's why you got to flip down here. You don't see this as much these days, but to me, it's not a $384,000 house because they built that money into it. Anyway, here's the other thing. I'm not going to get too much in the weeds here, but I'm going to look at the description. I'm going to see, what does it have to brag about? The agent remarks, the public remarks. It says tall windows, fresh paint. That's the sort of thing. New tile that I'm looking for. But things like open kitchen, 2-story, that's what you say when you have nothing to brag about. You're just kind of telling about the plan itself. Really, I want to see the pictures, but I want to see if there's anything extra I should know about while I'm looking. It says it's back on the market. Oh, I'm also noticing it took them 6 months. Something was fishy about this house. The next thing I'm going to do is look at their history. Because if it took 6 months, I guarantee they started out asking too much. And so if we look at the MLS number here, they started out at 461 originally, back in June of 22. Eventually, a month later, dropped to 435. That's a huge adjustment. Something tells me they were way off on their estimate of value. And then another, not even 2 weeks, they went down to 428. Another month later, 418. Another few days later, 413. This is how not to do it, guys. Another month later, 406. Another few days later. I mean, really, how much time could they have saved if they had priced it smarter to begin with? This is classic overpricing. Then they dropped it to finally the 384 in October of 22. They took a break for some reason. They went back on the market. They went under contract. Imagine if they would have priced it at 385 or 390 from the get-go. This would not be a 6 months on the market situation. So let's take a look at pictures. I'll look at them next. Now that I know the deal with kind of some history. Vacant but neutral. Looks like it's not like dirty. Looks in pretty good shape. And I'm waiting to see if the kitchen and bathrooms are dated. I'm anticipating they might be. And that's not bad. White cabinets are good. Oh, counters look like a stone of some sort. It's pretty modern, the flooring seems a little dated. So they might have put their money in the cabinets and the counters, but not bothered to redo the flooring. That probably needs to be something different. That might have slowed them down. They've got the typical grayish color. Oh, look at that. You can see out the window. It might be, I'm not sure if that's golf course or road. That might be golf course. I'm not sure. That's a terrible picture. Pretty sure that might be the road because that's the brick fence along the back. And that would have also affected its selling too. But the condition is overall pretty good. So how does that compare to our subject? That's what my thought is the whole time. And we don't have a subject in mind, so I don't know. But then I'll go on to the next one. I might make some notes about it. Go on to the next one. They were asking $393. They got $390. We scroll on down. Let's check that out. Oh, look. They really got $390 paying $5,000. So they essentially got $385. Now, when they allow to pay the buyer's closing costs and build it in like this, it still has to appraise for the $390. That's important. They can't just add like $20,000 to it and sell it for $410 or whatever if it won't appraise for the $410. That's the limiting factor in building closing cost into the price when you're trying to structure it this way for a seller paying closing costs. If we do the same thing, let's take a look at the remarks. We've got neutral paint, hardwood floors, blinds throughout. That's not hugely great. I mean, it's just a thing that's probably pretty typical. Tree-lined yard. Talk about Google Nest and energy efficient thermostat. I'm not seeing anything just knocking my socks off yet. Steps from the interior of the home into the garage are not secure. You could die. Be careful. Fireplace is being sold as is. They don't want to, well, the whole house is being sold as is, but they're just saying don't build a fire until you have it inspected. And there apparently is some sort of a leasing restriction in place that they're making sure people are aware of because so many buyers are wanting to turn around and flip or put a renter in. And notice a couple things down here that might have factored into the situation that we aren't covering in this course, but is true in real life. For one thing, congratulations, your days on market is normal for our market. That's pretty good. But what's up with that? Do you think maybe paying 1% to the buyer agent slowed it down? No, because it only took 8 days. But I don't know. If it had taken like 180 days like that last house, I would probably blame this a little bit. Not that I should, not that agents shouldn't show it, but some agents won't show it. In this case, it didn't seem to have hurt them. It's just a thing. It's negotiable. But some agents, and there's a push and a lawsuit that says you shouldn't be able to search for the amount of commission you're making, which is kind of weird because I bet the same people know how much they're going to make before they do the work. But that's a thing, its own little thing. If we go down and look at the pictures, that'd be the next step again. That looks pretty sharp. Kitchen might be a little dated. Still has Formica, has the white, not the cool white appliances, not the frosted white. It has the stainless steel handle, and they charge a premium for it. It's your classic grandma white appliances. Just very basic kitchen for what I've seen so far. Sometimes, there it is, yeah. That's a pretty good one, but you'll notice sometimes they're doing this these days. They're virtually staging, but they have to disclose it. No weird floating chairs or anything, but they'll usually put a picture of the room empty right after the virtually staged one. And we just make our way on through, and there's a case They virtually staged the bedroom as well. Bathroom needs some work. It's got the old seashell sink and some really worn cabinets and the old linoleum flooring. So all that's in the granny brass light fixture. But the shower looks like it was relatively recent. The mirror is old. So that needs some help. And so we would factor that into the equation as well. So it's that kind of thing. We're just making a list of the differences and similarities and figuring out the values. An appraiser's doing it. We're doing it too. But the thing that we result in accomplishing is called a market analysis and a probable sales price. If we were to go back out to this and maybe we picked 3 or 4 of them, we could then look at some stats and kind of see what typical sales to list price ratio might be, meaning how much of what they were asking did they actually get. And each of these 4 that we narrowed down to got at least what they were asking, if not more. But we also know sometimes that built in that doesn't take into account the seller paid concessions. Price per square foot, it does that calculation for you. In this case, 183 to 200, that's the range. And then how long did they take to sell? This one is certainly the outlier. And that's not great. 54 days is not typical. There was probably some stuff going on with that one that we would probably discover if we dug deeply into it. So that's kind of how this stuff goes. Here we go. Let's take a look at our guy here. Who's this guy? Anybody know? That's the Heisman Trophy. And he's doing his classic stiff arm, right? Because what an appraisal or market analysis should involve is arm's length transactions. You don't want, if you're trying to figure out the value of your listing, first of all, I said the V word. If you're trying to figure out the probable sales price of your listing that you're trying to get, you want to go for comps that are not family selling to family, or an estate sale, or a foreclosure, if that's not the situation of this subject property you're dealing with. I had one that sold and the appraisal came in like $10,000 low, and we appealed it. And the appraiser says, well, I'm not changing it. I stand by my work. That appraiser did his work in March of 2020. He knocked on the door. My seller client was at home with her newborn, March of 2020. And her mom, thankfully. Everybody was nervous because, again, it was March of 2020. They show up the door. He didn't make an appointment. They're supposed to make the appointment. I didn't know he was coming because he just showed up. Strike one. He also said, well, because of COVID, I can't walk through the house, but I do want to just walk through the living room to get to the backyard. And I'm like, he said, what? She told me all this like a minute after he left because she was frazzled, as you would be. He just went to the backyard to take a quick picture of the back, and then he left. He did not measure it. They're supposed to measure it. I measure it, and then I want to see what they come up with to see how close I was. But he went off of my measurement. He didn't walk through the upstairs of the house. He did it all wrong, like 3 strikes easily. No appointment. I mentioned all of those things in the appeal when he had the gall to come in $10,000 lower than contract price. One of the comparables that he used was around the corner. This was a 2-story subject property. He picked a 1-story comparable that was like 500 or 600 feet larger and sold for $10,000 or $15,000 less than our contract price. There's something going on when a bigger house sells for lower than your subject. I went ahead. There was no special notes involved under that one. And so I called the listing agent on that house that sold around the corner. And I said, anything you could tell me, just trying to get some resolution on this appraisal situation of my listing around the corner. What was going on with your sale? Oh, it was an estate sale. They didn't mention it that way. In the MLS, they're supposed to, but they didn't. He didn't know any different. The appraiser just went off of the number. Also, the kids who inherited it because it was an estate sale sold it to their best friend. Do you think that qualifies as an arm's length transaction? If they're selling it to their best friend, they probably gave their friend a deal because they didn't even really think of it as their house to begin with. It was a house that landed in their lap because it was an estate. And this appraiser never called the listing agent to learn this information and give any sort of an adjustment to allow for that fact. He just said, oh, a bigger house sold for less, so therefore this one must be less. We appealed. He refused, and that was all there was. So my seller had to agree to come down if they wanted to hold on to this sale, and they did, so they did. They came down. I think we might have met closer to the lower number than the higher. We didn't meet dead in the middle, but I think we did. Seller did come down quite a bit just because he already had his heart set on the next one. Not cool, right? So arm's length transaction needs to be no conflict of interest, like family selling to family, friend selling to friend. Do they report it in the MLS? Not necessarily. You might need to go above and beyond and call the agent and say, I know you had a closing last month on this one down the street. Help me out here. Sometimes I get calls from appraisers who say, I'm trying to appraise the one around the corner from something you closed 3 months ago. Curious, could you tell me more about the condition? I can't get in it, obviously. The condition or the transaction. So arm's length transactions only. And so then you're going to make adjustments. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But until then, just make your way through this chapter. We're going to get more into how we actually make adjustments for differences in square feet particularly. And then we'll get into that cost approach and that income approach. We're going to see a pretty scary looking equation, but don't worry. I'll talk you through it. It's this thing, and it applies to income property. And if you really think about it, if you were to buy a rental property, you'd want to know, let's say it's a duplex. You're going to say to yourself, well, how much would I make in a year if both sides of this duplex were rented out? And if we expand that into a 100-unit apartment building, it's the same thing, right? How much money would I make as gross income in blue if all 100 units were rented out in a given year? Well, in the 100-unit apartment situation, we know it's much more likely that all of them will be rented out all the time. And in fact, some investors will tell you, I don't want them to all be rented out at the same time, because that probably is an indicator that I'm not asking enough in rent. Investors want to set a rental amount so that they have a typical vacancy rate of maybe like 95, 96, 97, maybe even less. They would rather have fewer people renting it for a higher rent than everybody renting it at a lower rent, because it means less money to their pocket at the bottom line. So you're going to factor out for that vacancy rate. Then you're going to subtract out for how much it costs to run that little business. Do you have to pay housekeeping? Do you have to pay a repair person? Do you have to keep the parking lot paved or the roofs replaced or whatever it costs? Whether it's a duplex or a big apartment complex, there are expenses. Maybe there's an on-site manager you have to pay a salary of. You subtract all of that and you get to a very important and probably common item that you're not that you're familiar with, called net operating income. And so we'll see how that relates to value tomorrow. Have a good night. I'll see you then.